Tonight we are going to spend a few hours looking very closely at a cartoon. Not the plots, not the jokes you already know by heart. We are going to look at the corners of the frame, the signs nobody reads, the single-frame gags that flash by faster than the eye can register, the equations scribbled on chalkboards by writers with doctorates, the names carved into tombstones in the background of a Halloween special, the tiny letters hidden inside a character's hairline for 36 years. The Simpsons has aired for more than 3.5 decades, and in that time it has become the most densely decorated show in the history of television. Every frame is a room, and almost every room has something tucked behind the furniture. Some of it was put there to be found. Some of it was put there by animators who assumed nobody would ever be able to pause a broadcast in 1992. And some of it is still being discovered right now, by people watching in high definition on screens the original artists could never have imagined. So get comfortable. Turn the lights down. You do not need to remember any of this. Let it wash over you like a warm room you are slowly leaving. Let's begin where every episode begins. There is a 1.5 minutes of animation that has played more times than almost any other 1.5 minutes of animation ever made. You have seen it thousands of times. You could probably hum it from memory right now. The horns coming in over the clouds, the choir of children singing the name of the family. And you have almost certainly never actually watched it. That is not a criticism, it is the design. The opening titles of The Simpsons were built as wallpaper, something warm and familiar that plays while you are still settling in, while somebody is getting a drink, while the room quiets down. Wallpaper is exactly where you hide things. And the people making this show hid an enormous amount inside that 1.5 minutes. Let's walk through it slowly. The sequence opens on clouds. The camera pushes through them, and the title appears, and then we drop down into the town. This was designed by David Silverman, one of the show's foundational animators, and it was built under an unusual constraint. The original opening had to be long. It had to be almost 2 minutes, because in the earliest days the show was running short, and the titles were a place to eat time. So Silverman filled it. He filled it with a tour of the entire town, and in doing so he accidentally created the definitive map of a place that would later refuse to exist on any real map. The first thing we see after the clouds is Springfield Elementary School, and inside it, Bart is writing lines on the chalkboard. We will spend an entire section on that chalkboard later tonight, because it deserves one. For now, notice something simpler. Notice that Bart is being punished before the episode has even started. The show establishes its central character in his natural habitat within 4 seconds, without a word of dialogue, and then it lets him escape. He grabs his skateboard. The bell rings. He is gone. Then we cut to the power plant. Homer is at his station in Sector 7G, and he is holding a glowing green rod with a pair of tongs. The whistle blows. He tosses the tongs over his shoulder, and the rod goes flying down the back of his hazard suit. He does not notice. He climbs into his car. The rod falls out of his collar and lands in the street. Forgotten. Think about that for a second, and then let it go, because the show certainly did. Every single week, in the opening credits, Homer Simpson steals a piece of radioactive material from a nuclear facility and drops it in the road on his way home. Nobody follows up. Nobody checks. The material simply enters the town's ecosystem, and the horns keep playing. In the high-definition opening, which arrived in Season 20 and replaced the original after nearly 2 decades, that moment got an addition. The rod bounces into the street and a 3-eyed fish or a bird interacts with it, depending on the version, and the joke gets 1 layer thicker. But the original version is the purer one. The original version doesn't comment. It just shows you a man carrying poison home in his shirt. Now we move to the supermarket. Marge is at the checkout with Maggie. And here is one of the most quietly famous hidden details in the entire show. Maggie is placed on the conveyor belt. She goes past the scanner, and the register reads a number. $847.63. That is not a random figure. According to the show's own creative team, that number was chosen because it was, at the time, an estimate of the monthly cost of raising a baby in the United States. The gag is that a checkout scanner has correctly priced an infant. It flashes past in well under a second. It went unnoticed by most of the audience for years, until home video and then the internet gave people the ability to freeze a frame and stare at it. And that number changed. In the high-definition opening, the scanner no longer shows a price at all. It shows a message. Maggie is scanned and the register displays a phrase about firearms advocacy, a small political needle dropped into the most-watched title sequence on television. It is there every week. Most people have never seen it. Marge screams when she notices Maggie on the belt, picks her up, and Maggie's head pops out of the bagged groceries in the car. Watch Maggie's face for the rest of the sequence. She mirrors Marge. She turns the steering wheel with her own tiny wheel. She honks. She has agency in the credits that she almost never gets in the show, and it is the earliest hint that this baby is paying more attention than anyone gives her credit for. Then Lisa. Lisa is in band practice, and she is playing something that is not what the rest of the band is playing. She takes a solo. The conductor points at her. She is ejected from the room, still playing, and she walks out with the saxophone in her mouth and her head held high. Here is the detail. That solo is different almost every time. The saxophone solo in the opening credits is one of the 3 variable elements of the sequence, alongside the chalkboard gag and the couch gag. Different episodes feature different solos, some short, some long, some in completely different keys and styles. They were composed and recorded over the years, and they get shuffled and reused, which means the version you heard as a child and the version you hear now might have nothing in common. It is a tiny, invisible variation that most viewers register only subconsciously, as a feeling that something is slightly different tonight without being able to say what. And then everyone drives home. This is where the sequence becomes a game. In the run to the couch, background characters appear, and over the years the animators use those few seconds as a dumping ground for cameos. Bart skates past a crowd of townspeople. In different versions of the opening, that crowd changes. Characters who had only just been introduced would appear there. Characters who had been retired would sometimes linger. If you were the kind of person who watched the credits with the attention you would normally give the episode, you could track the town's population growing in real time. There is a moment where Homer's car nearly hits Bart on the driveway. In the very first version of the opening, from the earliest seasons, Bart jumps and skates over the hood. Later versions change this. There is a version where Homer swerves. There is a version where Bart is not there at all. Marge's car and Homer's car nearly collide in the garage. Grandpa Simpson's newspaper reading is interrupted. Lisa's bicycle appears and disappears. And then the family converges on the living room and hits the couch. The couch gag. If you were going to point to one single element of The Simpsons that best explains what kind of show it is, you could reasonably point at the couch gag. It is a completely disposable few seconds of animation that appears before the story starts, contributes nothing to the plot, will never be referenced again, and has been produced fresh, over and over, for more than 700 episodes. It exists for exactly one reason. Somebody thought it would be funny. In the beginning, the couch gags were simple physical jokes. The family runs in and the couch tips over backward. They run in and Homer gets squeezed out the side. They run in and there is a fat man already sitting there. They pile up in the wrong order. Bart gets flattened. The couch collapses. These are the gags of a show finding its rhythm, and there is something lovely about their simplicity. Somebody drew a couch and then thought about all the ways a couch could go wrong. But the show kept going. And once you have used every obvious joke about a couch, you have to start reaching. So the couch gags began to mutate. The family arrives and finds themselves in a museum, mounted as an exhibit. The family arrives as clay figures and melt. The family arrives and the couch runs away from them. The family becomes a set of bowling pins. The couch becomes a monster. The living room becomes a swimming pool. Homer arrives alone, sits, and nothing happens, which is a joke about the audience's expectation of a joke. By the middle seasons, the couch gag had become the show's laboratory. It was the place where the animation staff could try things they could never try in an episode. Because it was self-contained and consequence-free, you could break the rules of the show entirely for 10 seconds and then snap back to normal. Any style, any medium, any tone. And then, eventually, the show started inviting guests. This is where the couch gag turned into a genuine cultural artifact. In season 22, an episode opened with a couch gag directed by the street artist Banksy. It begins normally, with the family running in and sitting down. Then the camera pulls back, and back, and back, and we descend into a vast, grim underground factory in which chained workers hand-paint animation cells of the show, dip them in vats of toxic liquid, and feed them into machinery. Kittens are used to stuff merchandise. A dolphin's carcass is used to seal boxes. A unicorn punches holes in DVD centers with its horn. That aired on network television, on a Sunday night. attached to a show owned by one of the largest media companies on Earth. The sequence was a direct comment on the practice of outsourcing animation labor overseas, and the show ran it as its own opening. Reportedly, the sequence caused significant internal discomfort. Animation staff described it as controversial. It required approval up the chain and it delayed production. And it went out anyway, because the couch gag is a protected space, and once you have decided the couch gag is a protected space, you have to honor that even when the guest uses it to point a finger at you. There have been others. Guillermo del Toro directed a Halloween opening that is less a couch gag and more a 3-minute love letter to a century of horror cinema, packed so densely with references that people have made entire annotated guides to it. You can find Frankenstein's monster, the creature from Black Lagoon-style horror, Hitchcock, silent-era German expressionism, tentacled cosmic dread, and a version of the Simpson family that has been absorbed into all of it. Del Toro's own films appear. Characters from his imagination sit alongside characters from 1920s Berlin. The animator Bill Plimpton contributed couch gags in his own hand-drawn, warping, elastic style, in which the couch becomes a romantic partner for Homer, and their relationship goes through a full arc, including infidelity and heartbreak, in under a minute. The French animator Sylvain Chomet made one in the style of his own films, all rubbery limbs and melancholy European texture, in which the family becomes something closer to a Jacques Tati painting than a Fox cartoon. The team behind a certain science fiction cartoon about a scientist and his grandson made a couch gag in which the Simpson family is spattered across the living room, and the visiting characters have to clean up the mess before anyone notices, which they do badly. And then there is the one that people still argue about. Don Hertzfeldt, an independent animator known for stick figures and existential dread, was invited to make a couch gag. What he produced begins with the ordinary living room, and then a distortion appears in the corner of the screen. Something rips, and the family is pulled through into a far distant future, in which the show still exists, thousands of years later, in a form that has degraded beyond recognition. The characters have become squirming, multi-mouthed, howling shapes. They chant catchphrases that have decayed into nonsense. There is a moment where a distorted Homer figure repeats a fragment of a familiar phrase, over and over, and it stops being funny somewhere in the middle. It ran on network television, at 8 o'clock, before a normal episode. Nothing about it is a joke, exactly. It is a piece of art about the horror of a franchise that cannot be allowed to end. And the show that cannot be allowed to end put it in its own opening credits and then continued as normal for the next 22 minutes. There have been couch gags that lasted for several minutes. There have been couch gags that were used as episode-length parodies, most famously one that turned into an extended send-up of a certain prestige drama title sequence, complete with the sprawling family history and the sweeping camera moves. There have been couch gags animated in the style of video games, in the style of stop motion, in the style of a certain long-running claymation series about a man and his dog, in the style of Japanese animation, and in the style of a paper cutout puppet show. And here is the practical secret behind all of it, the piece of production trivia that explains why the couch gag became so elastic. Episode length. A television episode has to hit a precise runtime, not approximately, precisely. And an animated episode is expensive to change once it's finished. So the show's editors needed something at the front of the episode that could stretch or shrink on demand. That is what the couch gag is. It is a rubber band. If the episode came in long, the couch gag would be trimmed to almost nothing, sometimes cut to a single frame of the family already sitting down. If the episode came in short, the couch gag would be extended, and sometimes a whole new one would be commissioned to fill the space. Which means that the funniest, strangest, most elaborate couch gags in the show's history exist because somebody's script ran 20 seconds under. Great art produced by an accounting problem. There is a related trick you may have noticed without noticing. Sometimes the entire opening is skipped. The episode simply begins. This is not an oversight. It happens when an episode is so long that the credits have to be sacrificed entirely, and in those cases you get a compressed version, just the title over the clouds, and then straight into the story. Some of the most acclaimed episodes in the show's history open this way, because they were too full to make room for the ritual. And then, in season 20, everything changed. The show moved to high definition, and for the first time since the beginning, the opening sequence was rebuilt from scratch. This was a genuinely significant event for people who care about this show, and the new sequence is a treasure box. It is longer, It is wider, and it is packed with details that were physically impossible in the old format because there simply were not enough pixels to draw them. In the new opening, the camera swoops over Springfield, and you can see the town properly. There is a nuclear power plant with its cooling towers. There is the Springfield Gorge. There is a billboard. There are recurring characters going about their business in the background of a shot that lasts 3 seconds. The bird that appears near the beginning gets electrocuted. There is a moment where a certain sad little man is crushed. There is a sequence in which a character we associate with menace is glimpsed hiding somewhere he should not be. There are storefronts with legible names. There is graffiti on walls that says things. And crucially, the new opening added a fourth variable element. Alongside the chalkboard, the saxophone, and the couch, the high-definition sequence includes a billboard gag. The billboard changes from episode to episode, carrying a different joke each week, most of them advertisements for products or services that could only exist in this town. That means that in the modern era, the opening credits contain 4 independent randomized slots, 4 little lottery tickets before the story starts. If you watched every episode of the modern run and cataloged all 4 slots, you would have a body of jokes larger than the scripts of most sitcoms. There is one more thing about the opening I want to leave you with before we move on, and it is my favorite piece of trivia about the whole sequence. The very first version of the opening, the one from the earliest seasons, contains an animation choice that has been quietly preserved and quietly abandoned depending on the era. When Homer pulls into the driveway, in some versions, Marge's car is already there. In others, it arrives simultaneously. In others, they nearly collide. Over the years, the animators fiddled with this, adjusting timings and physics, and the result is that there is no single canonical version of how the Simpson family arrives home. They have arrived home more than 700 times, and they have never done it the same way twice. That is the show in miniature, a ritual that is identical every week and has never once actually repeated. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something, and it is a small thing. Wherever you are right now, whatever time it is on your clock, drop a comment and tell me. The city, the country, the hour on your phone, I love reading them. There is something genuinely lovely about scrolling through and finding somebody at 2 in the morning in Manila, and somebody at 11 at night in Ohio, and somebody at 4 in the afternoon in Dublin, who just wanted something calm playing in the background. It turns a video into a room full of people who never meet. And if you are enjoying this so far, if this is the sort of thing you would like more of while you are falling asleep, go ahead and hit subscribe. It genuinely helps, and it costs you 1 tap. That is all. Get comfortable again. We have a very long way to go, and the next thing we are going to look at is a small green rectangle on a wall in an elementary school. There is a green rectangle on a wall in a classroom in Springfield Elementary School, and a 10-year-old boy has been writing on it since 1989. He is being punished. That is the entire premise, established in 4 seconds at the top of every episode. Bart Simpson has done something, we are never told what, and the consequence is that he must write a sentence on the board over and over until the bell rings. And in the course of serving that endless detention, Bart Simpson has produced one of the strangest bodies of work in television. Hundreds of lines. Some of them are jokes about being a child. Some of them are jokes about the show itself. Some of them are apologies to real cities. Some of them are quiet, sad little admissions that the writers slipped past the network because nobody was reading closely. Tonight we are going to read closely. Let's start with the mechanics because they matter. The chalkboard gag is one of the show's variable slots, alongside the couch. It is written fresh for each episode, it lasts a few seconds, and like the couch gag, it can be cut entirely if an episode runs long. When you notice an episode that goes straight from the school bell to Homer at the plant with no chalkboard in between, that is not a mistake. That is an editor buying back 4 seconds. The line is always written multiple times. Bart writes it, and it repeats up the board in his handwriting, and then the bell rings and he runs. In some versions, he does not finish. In some versions, the board is already full when we arrive. And in a handful of very special cases, the gag breaks its own format entirely, which we will get to. The earliest chalkboard gags are almost sweet in their simplicity. They are the kind of thing a real child might be made to write. Promises not to waste chalk, promises not to belch the national anthem, promises not to make flatulent noises in class. They are punishments that suggest an offense, and the comedy is entirely in imagining what happened just before. That is the machine at the heart of the gag. Every chalkboard line is the punchline to a story you never see. Somewhere off-screen, at some point that morning, Bart did a thing so specific that the school's disciplinary response was to make him write about it 24 times. And you have to build the incident yourself. Consider a line about not selling school property. Somewhere in that building, a 10-year-old ran an unauthorized market. Consider a line about not preparing food in class. Consider a line about not celebrating a teacher's misfortune. Consider a line promising that a certain part of the human body is not a toy. Each of those is a missing episode. The show wrote hundreds of missing episodes on that board and never made a single one of them. Now let's get to the ones that are doing something more complicated. The show figured out fairly early that the chalkboard could break the fourth wall in a way the episodes themselves usually couldn't. Bart is writing lines as punishment inside the fiction, but the audience is reading them as a message from the writers. That double channel is enormously useful, and the show exploited it constantly. So you get lines where Bart appears to be commenting on the show's own status, lines acknowledging that the audience has seen this before, lines acknowledging that the show has been on for a very long time. There is a famous one, deployed at a moment when the series was well past its second decade, in which the line is simply an admission that nobody reads these anymore. It is written on the board, multiple times, by a character who has been 10 years old for longer than most of the audience has been alive. There are lines that acknowledge the show's declining critical reputation, lines that acknowledge merchandise, lines that acknowledge the fact that the show has outlived its own competitors. The writers used that green rectangle as a confessional booth, and because it lasted 3 seconds and appeared before the story, they got away with things they could never have put in a script. Then there are the apologies. This is where the chalkboard becomes genuinely fascinating as a historical document, because on more than one occasion it has been used to respond to real events in the real world. The most famous instance concerns the city of New Orleans. In an early season, the show produced an episode in which the community stages a musical adaptation of a certain famous American play set in that city. The musical's opening number describes New Orleans in terms that are, let us say, unflattering. It calls the place a number of things. It is a very funny song, sung with enormous energy, and it is a parody of the way a bad regional theater production would open. New Orleans did not find it funny. The response was substantial. Local media covered it, there were complaints, there was genuine civic offense taken at a national television show characterizing the city that way, and the show responded. Not with a press release, with a chalkboard gag. The following week, Bart Simpson wrote a line promising not to defame that city, over and over, on a green board in a fictional classroom. That was the apology. That was the entire corporate response of a major television production to a public relations problem. A cartoon child writing lines. There is something almost perfect about that. The show found a way to apologize that was itself a joke about apologizing, delivered by a character whose entire function is insincere contrition. The chalkboard has been used to mark milestones as well. Round number episodes have received custom lines, usually mocking the very idea of celebrating a round number. There is a line about not celebrating pointless milestones, written for an episode that was itself a pointless milestone. When the show reached numbers that no scripted series had ever reached, the board acknowledged it with a shrug. And when the Simpsons movie was released, the chalkboard came with it. The film opens with the family at the cinema watching a cartoon, and Homer stands up and berates the audience for paying to see something they could watch at home for free. But the film also contains a chalkboard gag, and the line is a promise not to illegally download the movie you are currently watching, in a cinema, where you have paid. The joke lands on the pirates who would inevitably be watching a camera recording of that exact frame within days. Which they were. And they saw the line. And the line was about them. Let's talk about the ones that break the format. Occasionally, the show gets bored of the rules and does something structurally odd with the board. There is a version in which the line refers to the walls, and the writing is not on the board at all, but scrawled across every surface of the classroom. There is a version in which the joke is about the length of the line, and it is so long that Bart cannot possibly finish it, and the bell rings while he is still on the first attempt. There is a version in which Bart writes something and then erases it, correcting himself. There is a version where the handwriting changes, suggesting somebody else took over. There is a beautiful one where the line concerns the futility of the exercise itself, and Bart writes it with visible resignation. And there are the ones written for specific occasions. Holiday episodes get holiday-appropriate crimes. Halloween specials often skip the chalkboard entirely or replace the whole opening with something else, because the Halloween episodes have their own separate set of rituals, and we will spend a long time in that particular graveyard later tonight. Now, here is a piece of production detail that I think is genuinely lovely, and it concerns the handwriting. The chalkboard lines are not typed, they are drawn. Every single one of those lines is hand-lettered by an animator in a font designed to look like the writing of a 10-year-old boy who does not care about the assignment. Which means somebody in a room has spent thousands of hours over 3 decades carefully drawing the sloppy handwriting of a fictional child. And that handwriting is consistent. It has a style. The letters lean, certain characters have particular quirks. If you put a chalkboard gag from 1990 next to one from 2020, the hand is recognizably the same hand, maintained across generations of artists like a monastery preserving a script. There is also the question of what happens when Bart runs out of board. Watch closely and you will notice that the line repeats up the board a variable number of times, and the number of repetitions is not random. It is determined by how long the line is. A short line repeats many times. A long line might only appear twice. The animators had to fit the text into a fixed rectangle, which means every chalkboard gag is a small typesetting problem. The comedy had to be written to a character count. That constraint produced a specific rhythm. The best chalkboard lines are short, they punch, they deliver the entire premise in 6 or 7 words and leave the rest to your imagination. Longer ones tend to be weaker, because you spend the 3 seconds reading rather than laughing, which is a lesson about comedy that the show learned by drawing on a wall. Let's talk about what the chalkboard tells us about Bart as a character, because there is something quietly sad hiding in there. Bart Simpson is defined by rebellion. He is the underachiever, the prankster, the kid who does not care. That is the marketing. That is the merchandise. That was the t-shirt phenomenon of the early 90s, which we will come back to, because the merchandise has its own set of buried secrets. But look at what he actually does in the credits. He writes the lines. Every week, for 36 years, Bart Simpson has been assigned a punishment and has completed it. He does not refuse. He does not walk out. He does not write something rude instead, except on the rare occasions when the joke requires it. He gets the assignment, he does the assignment, and when the bell rings, he leaves. The most rebellious child in American popular culture is, in the opening credits of his own show, quietly compliant. There is a whole reading of the character available in that. The kid who acts out constantly but always shows up, who takes the punishment, who has internalized the system he claims to be fighting. Every single episode opens with Bart Simpson accepting the consequences of an action we never see, and then running out the door to be the free spirit he is supposed to be, having already served his time. The show never says any of this. The show just shows you a kid writing on a board for 36 years and lets you do the arithmetic. Now, let's go through some of the categories, because once you start sorting the chalkboard lines, you find that they cluster in ways that reveal what was on the writers' minds at various points. There is a large cluster of lines about bodily functions, concentrated in the early seasons, when the show was still calibrated for a younger audience, and when a boy saying a rude word on television was itself a small event. There is a cluster of lines about school property, fire safety, and the specific hazards of a badly funded public school. These read differently now than they did then. A line about not tampering with fire alarms is a joke about a mischievous child, but it also sits inside a school with a budget so destroyed that the students share textbooks with pages missing. There is a cluster about teachers, and about the specific misery of the faculty at that school. There is an entire subgenre of chalkboard lines that amount to Bart apologizing for noticing that his teachers are unhappy. There is a cluster about religion, concentrated around holiday episodes, and these are among the boldest lines the show ever put on that board, because they say things about faith and church attendance that would have caused enormous problems in a script. There is a cluster about the show's own network and the corporate entity that owns it. The Simpsons has always had an unusual license to insult its parent company, and the chalkboard is one of the places it exercises that license most freely. Lines about the network's other programming, lines about executives, lines about the fact that the show is a product, and there is a cluster, growing larger as the years pass, about mortality, about the show's age, about the fact that everyone involved is getting older except the boy holding the chalk. Those are the ones that get me. Somewhere in the modern seasons, a writer sat down to produce a 3-second gag for a cartoon that has been running since before they were born, and they wrote a line about a 10-year-old who will never turn 11. and an animator drew it in a child's handwriting, and it played to millions of people who were not looking at the screen. Here is something I want you to try. If you ever have an evening free and nothing better to do, find a list of every chalkboard gag in order and read them start to finish. It takes about an hour, and what you get is a strange, fragmented autobiography of a television show. You can feel the confidence of the early years, all energy and rudeness. You can feel the peak, where every line is precisely calibrated and effortlessly funny. You can feel the wobble in the middle years, where some of them try too hard. And you can feel the late period, which is quieter, more reflective, more aware of its own strangeness, occasionally almost tender. It is a diary written 4 seconds at a time by a rotating staff of hundreds of people across 4 decades, in the handwriting of a child who does not exist. Now, a few specific ones worth pulling out, because they demonstrate the range. There is a line deployed after a real-world event involving a celebrity in which the chalkboard gag serves as an obituary. The show has occasionally used the board to acknowledge a death, usually of somebody connected to the production. The line will be simple, unfunny, and sincere. And it is the only sincere thing in the entire opening sequence. Everything around it is a joke, and then for 3 seconds it is not, and then the couch gag happens and a piano falls on somebody. There is a line concerning a certain word that was invented by the show and later entered actual dictionaries, which we will discuss at length in a later section. The chalkboard has been used to acknowledge the show's own contributions to the English language, which is a level of self-awareness that most shows never earn the right to have. There is a line that consists of the same word repeated, which is a joke about the format itself, because the format is already repetition. There is a line about the futility of writing lines. There is a line about the futility of watching a show about writing lines. There is, at least once, a line that is essentially an acknowledgement that both parties in this exchange, the boy and the audience, are stuck in the same loop and have been for a very long time. And there is one more thing about the chalkboard that I want to leave with you, and it concerns what happens after. When the bell rings, Bart grabs his skateboard and escapes out the door of the classroom. He goes down the hall. He goes out of the building. In the original opening, he is genuinely fleeing, and the animation has real velocity to it, which means that every episode of The Simpsons begins with an escape. Before we meet anyone, before the story starts, we watch a child complete a punishment and then run for the exit. And then we spend 22 minutes watching him fail to actually get anywhere, because nothing in Springfield ever changes and nobody ever escapes anything. Next week, he will be back at the board, writing something else, about something else he did, that we will never see. The chalkboard is a machine for generating stories that will never be told, in a town where the same story is told forever. Let's leave the classroom. Let's go outside, into the streets, and look at what is written on the walls. Springfield is a town made of writing. Once you start noticing this, you cannot stop. Every street has storefronts, and every storefront has a name, and almost every name is a joke. Every church has a signboard, and every signboard has been updated with a fresh line. Every cinema has a marquee. Every newspaper has a headline. Every billboard sells something that does not exist. Nobody in the story ever reads any of it. The characters walk past these signs without comment, the way you walk past the signage in your own neighborhood. The signs exist purely for the audience, and specifically for the portion of the audience that pauses. For the first 15 years of the show, that portion was small. You had to be recording on tape and willing to squint. Then home video, then high definition, then the internet, and suddenly hundreds of thousands of people could read the fine print in a background painting from 1993. An enormous body of hidden comedy was excavated all at once, and the people who had drawn it were mildly astonished that anyone had found it. Let's take a walk through town. We begin at the Quick E-Mart, because everyone begins at the Quick E-Mart. The store's signage is a joke in itself, a phonetic butchering of the phrase quick and easy, and the establishment is neither. But look past the main sign. The windows of the Quick E-Mart are papered with advertisements, and those advertisements change constantly. They advertise products with names that suggest an entire off-screen economy of terrible food. Frozen items, novelty drinks in sizes that escalate past reason, promotional tie-ins for films that do not exist. The most famous of these is the drink whose size categories go beyond large into territory that suggests genuine health risk. The joke there is not the drink. The joke is that the sizes have names, and the names have been carefully escalated, and somebody in the fictional corporate structure of that chain approved them. The store's slogans in the window are frequently better than the dialogue in the scene. There are signs advertising the freshness of products that are visibly not fresh. There are signs claiming the store is open a number of hours per day that exceeds the number of hours in a day. There are signs apologizing for prices. Now walk down the street. You will pass a shop selling only left-handed products, which becomes a plot point in a famous episode but exists in the background long before and long after. You will pass a bookstore whose name indicates that it stocks the work of exactly 2 thriller novelists and nothing else, which is one of the sharpest jokes about American publishing ever made in 9 letters. You will pass a shop selling cookware whose name is a pun that got past the network by being technically about pots and pans. You will pass a military surplus store run by a one-armed man. You will pass a comic book shop whose name is a fantasy reference. You will pass a tavern with an unwashed window. You will pass a seafood restaurant run by a sea captain, whose all-you-can-eat promise becomes the basis of a lawsuit in 1 episode and is never adjusted afterward. There is a mall in Springfield, and the mall directory is one of the great hidden documents of the show. In several episodes, the camera lingers on that directory for just long enough to be legible if you freeze it. The store names on that board are a small anthology. They are puns of the kind that a real mall would actually use, which is what makes them work. Real malls are full of desperate wordplay. The show simply pushed real mall signage 1 degree further than reality and let it sit there. Then there is the church. The First Church of Springfield has a signboard out front, and that signboard has been used for jokes since the earliest seasons. It is one of the most reliable places in the show to find a hidden line. The church sign follows the real convention of announcing the week's sermon and the week's events, and the sermons are extraordinary. They announce topics that suggest an institution in a state of quiet theological collapse. They advertise a schedule of activities in which bingo appears more often than worship. They post messages that veer between fire and brimstone and open commercial desperation. There is a running thread on that sign about the congregation's dwindling attendance, about the collection plate, about the pastor's exhaustion. None of it is ever discussed in dialogue. It is simply posted outside the building every week like a small, sad status report. And here is what makes the church sign work as an Easter egg rather than just a gag. The sign is consistent with the character of the man running it. Reverend Lovejoy is a man who entered the ministry with genuine enthusiasm and had it beaten out of him by decades of one specific neighbor asking one specific type of question. The show establishes this properly in 1 episode. But the sign has been telling you the same story, 4 words at a time, for years before and years after. Let's cross the street to the cinema. The Aztec Theater has a marquee, and that marquee is one of the show's most consistent joke engines. It advertises films that do not exist, and the fake film titles are a genre unto themselves. Most of them are parodies of contemporary releases, which means the marquee doubles as a timestamp. You can date an episode fairly precisely by what is playing at the Aztec. Films with numbered sequels far beyond what any real franchise had reached. Films with titles that reveal their entire plot. Films that combine 2 incompatible genres. Films starring the fictional actors of Springfield, most notably a certain leading man whose career trajectory is one of the show's great sustained tragedies. The marquee also runs double features, and the pairing is often the joke. 2 films whose titles, read together, form a sentence. 2 films whose combination suggests a very confusing evening. And there is a running gag about the cinema's own condition. Signs about the state of the seats. Signs about the concession prices. Signs about whether the projectionist is currently present. Now let's look at the newspaper. The Springfield Shopper is the town's paper, and it appears constantly, usually held up by a character reading the front page. And the front page always has a headline, and the headline is always relevant to the plot. But look below the fold. The secondary headlines on the Springfield Shopper are among the most reliably hilarious hidden details in the show. While the main headline announces the crisis of the week, the smaller stories beside it report on the ongoing background insanity of the town. There will be a story about a municipal failure, a story about a local figure's humiliation, a story about a scientific discovery that would reshape human civilization, buried in a single column beside a piece about a bake sale. There is a recurring joke in which the subheadline undercuts the main headline entirely. The banner announces something dramatic, and the line beneath it reveals that the dramatic thing is far more mundane, or far worse, than it first appeared. And there is the recurring gag of the paper's continuing coverage of a story that the show has otherwise forgotten. A catastrophe from 6 episodes ago will get a follow-up in a corner of a newspaper prop, the only acknowledgement anywhere in the series that the event ever happened. Which is genuinely remarkable when you think about it. In a show famous for its reset button, for the way each episode wipes the previous one clean, the only institution that maintains continuity is a fictional newspaper that nobody in the audience is expected to read. Let's talk about billboards. The show's billboards advertise the products of Springfield's industries, and those industries are grim. There is a great deal of advertising for alcohol, most of it for a single brand with a monopoly. There is advertising for the power plant, which runs public relations campaigns of increasing desperation. There is advertising for the town's legal profession, which is predatory in a way that is very funny and only slightly exaggerated. And there are political billboards, which is where the show does some of its sharpest work. The campaign signage in Springfield is a genre of its own. Slogans that are honest to the point of self-destruction. Slogans that promise nothing. Slogans that admit the candidate's crimes and ask for your vote anyway. The mayor's campaign material in particular is a masterclass. This is a man whose corruption is not concealed. It is his platform. Now, the town's own signage. Springfield has a welcome sign, and it has a population figure, and that figure changes constantly across the run of the show. It has been in the tens of thousands. It has been in the millions. It has been crossed out and rewritten. This is partly a running gag and partly a consequence of the show's refusal to be pinned down, which we will discuss properly when we get to the question of where this town actually is. The town also has a motto, and the motto is one of the great hidden treasures of the series. In an episode about the town's founding, we learned that Springfield's official motto is a sentence containing a word that does not exist in English. The sentence appears on the town's seal, in the town's paperwork, and on the wall of the school. It states that a noble spirit makes the smallest man bigger, except that the word used for the act of making bigger is a word the show invented. That word has since entered actual dictionaries. We will come back to it. Springfield also has a sundial in the town square. That sundial is at the center of the show's most famous mystery. But look at it in other episodes, when it is just set dressing. It is always there. Nobody ever mentions it. It sits in the middle of the town like a piece of evidence waiting for the right episode to matter. There is a statue of the town founder, and that statue is a load-bearing piece of the town's mythology. It gets destroyed and rebuilt. Its head goes missing. Its inscription is legible in certain shots and says things that contradict what the town believes about itself. The town has a hall of records, a museum, a retirement home, a prison, a courthouse, and an aquarium. And every one of those buildings has signage that tells you something about how badly it is run. Let's spend a moment on the power plant's internal signage, because it is a masterpiece of environmental storytelling. The interior of the Springfield nuclear power plant is covered in warnings, notices, and instructional posters, and every single one of them is terrifying if you read it. There are safety posters that give incorrect advice. There are signs indicating the number of days since the last accident, with the number always in single digits and frequently 0. There are labels on machinery that do not match the machinery. There are exits that are marked but blocked. There is a poster about proper protective equipment hanging above workers who are not wearing any. There are radiation warnings on doors that swing freely. There is a control panel with buttons whose labels have worn off, which is played as a joke and is also, if you think about it, the single most alarming detail in the entire facility. And there is the sign in Homer's own workspace, which changes across episodes but frequently indicates that he is not qualified to be there. The show never draws attention to any of this. It is simply painted into the background of a room where a man sleeps at his desk. Now let's talk about how these signs are actually made, because this is where the production reality becomes lovely. Every one of those signs was drawn by hand by a background artist working from a script that, in most cases, did not specify what the sign should say. That is the crucial detail. Scripts describe locations. They rarely specify what is written on a storefront 3 doors down from where the scene takes place. So the background department was given latitude, and over the years that latitude became a tradition. The artists filled the town with jokes of their own invention, which means a meaningful percentage of the humor in this show was written by people whose job title was not writer. Painters and layout artists working on a deadline, quietly inserting gags into buildings that would appear on screen for a second and a half. Some of those artists developed signatures. There are running gags in the background art that persist across episodes because a particular artist kept using them. There are shops that appear repeatedly in the same position on the same street because somebody decided that street should be consistent even though no script ever required it. There are also errors that became canon. A building was mislabeled once, and the mislabeling was preserved, and now it is simply what that building is called. Let's go inside some of these buildings, because the interior signage is even better. Moe's Tavern is the most heavily decorated interior in Springfield. The walls are covered. There are beer advertisements, most of them for the single brand that dominates the town's supply. There are health code notices, and the grade displayed is never good. There is a sign about the tab policy. There is a sign about the bathroom. There is a photograph on the wall that changes depending on the episode and is sometimes deeply strange. There is a love tester machine, which becomes the focus of an episode and otherwise sits in the corner. There is a jukebox with a visible song list. There is a pool table with a rip in it. And there is the phone. The phone at Moe's is the target of Bart's prank calls, and the running gag around those calls is one of the most famous in television. But look at the phone itself in the background art. It is filthy. It has been drawn as filthy consistently for decades. Somebody made a decision about that phone in 1989, and every artist since has honored it. Then there is the Krusty Burger. The menu boards at Krusty Burger are legible in several episodes, and they are horrifying. The items are named with the enthusiasm of a marketing department that has stopped caring about food. There are meals with names that admit their own nutritional content. There are limited-time offerings tied to whatever film Krusty is promoting. There are prices that reveal an economy where a family meal costs almost nothing, which tells you something about wages in this town. There is a famous menu item built around a sandwich that is described in ways that make clear it should not be eaten, and an entire episode is constructed around the population's addiction to it. But the menu board carries other items that never get episodes. They are simply there, on the wall, waiting. The school cafeteria has its own menu board, and the items on it constitute one of the show's more pointed pieces of social commentary. Springfield Elementary's food service operates on a budget that forces creativity, and the creativity is alarming. The menu names things that are technically food, and the school's notice boards, its hallway posters, its motivational signage, all of it is drawn with enormous care and reads like the output of an institution in surrender. There are posters encouraging students to have hope in language that suggests the poster's author has none. There are trophies in the cabinet for achievements that are not achievements. There is a memorial to something. Now let's talk about the store names, because I want to give this its own moment. Springfield's economy is built on puns, and the puns operate on a specific principle. The best ones are not jokes about the show. They are jokes about the kind of business name a real, slightly desperate small business would choose. Real small businesses use puns. Real hair salons and real bakeries and real pet stores lean on wordplay because wordplay is free advertising. The show understood this and simply turned the dial one click. So you get a hair salon whose name is a pun on a phrase about hair. You get a plumbing business whose name is a pun about pipes. You get a butcher whose name is a pun about meat that is slightly too honest about what a butcher does. You get a mattress store, a tanning salon, a fitness center, all named by somebody who thought they were being clever and was very slightly wrong. The genius is in the slight wrongness. A perfect pun is a joke. A pun that almost works is a character study of the person who chose it. There is a shop in Springfield whose name suggests it sells only one extremely specific category of item, and the specificity is the joke because it implies a person whose entire livelihood depends on a market that cannot possibly exist. There are several of these. The town is full of businesses that should have closed and have not, which is a joke about small-town America that the show makes without a single line of dialogue. Let's talk about the medical signage, because Springfield's healthcare system deserves attention. Springfield General Hospital has signs. The signs are not reassuring. There is a wing named after somebody. There is a department whose services are described in terms that suggest the doctors are guessing. There is a directory that includes departments no hospital should have. Doctor Nick's clinic has its own signage, and it is a masterwork. The advertisements for his practice make promises about pricing and speed that no legitimate medical professional would make. There is a sign about the free gift with surgery. There is a sign about payment plans. There is a sign whose fine print, if you freeze it, contains a disclaimer that renders the entire advertisement meaningless. And the man's diplomas are on the wall. If you look at them closely in the episodes where the camera gets near enough, the institutions that issued them do not sound like institutions. Now, one of my favorite categories, the vending machines and the small appliances. Springfield's vending machines have visible product labels, and those labels are inventions. The snack foods of Springfield have names and packaging and mascots. There is a whole confectionery industry in this town that exists only as background art. There is a chocolate bar with a name. There is a chip brand with a mascot. There is a soft drink with a slogan. None of them are ever central to a plot. They simply appear in a machine, on a shelf, in a lunchbox, and they have been designed with a level of care that suggests somebody enjoyed doing it. The same is true of the television programming. Whenever a character turns on a television in Springfield, whatever is playing has a title, and the titles are jokes. There are game shows, soap operas, news programs, nature documentaries, cooking shows, and infomercials, and every one of them has a name that tells you what it is, and simultaneously mocks the genre. And there is the recurring gag of the channel guide, which appears occasionally and contains a full grid of fictional programming. Most of it unreadable at broadcast resolution, and all of it funny in high definition. Let's take one more walk before we move on, and let's walk somewhere specific. There is a cemetery in Springfield. The Springfield Cemetery appears in a number of episodes, and its headstones carry names. In the Halloween specials, the headstones become a dedicated joke space, and we will spend proper time there later tonight. But in the regular episodes, the cemetery is also carrying jokes, and they are quieter. There are graves belonging to characters who died in earlier episodes and were never mentioned again. There are graves belonging to people the show invented purely so that they could be buried. There are graves with epitaphs that suggest very specific and very sad lives. And there is one grave in that cemetery that is not a joke at all. There is a character in the history of this show who arrived, saw the town clearly, told everyone exactly what was wrong with it, and died for his trouble. His headstone appears. His name is on it. And in a much later episode, a version of him comes back and the show remembers. That grave is the single most emotionally loaded piece of background art in Springfield, and it is drawn in exactly the same style as a joke about a pun shop. The last thing I want to say about the signs concerns the practice of reading them. There is a specific pleasure in this that I think explains a lot about why this show has survived. Watching The Simpsons attentively is an activity with layers. On the first pass, you get the story. On the second pass, you get the jokes you missed. And then, if you are the kind of person who pauses, you get a third layer that consists entirely of things drawn by people who assumed nobody would ever look. That third layer is a gift left by artists to an audience they would never meet, decades in advance, on the assumption that technology would eventually make it visible. They were right. Every time somebody freezes a frame in 1994 and reads a sign that says something ridiculous about a shop that sells only one thing, a background painter who worked a 14-hour day in 1993 gets a laugh they never got to hear. The town is a message in a bottle, written in shop signs, thrown 30 years forward. Sleep well on that one. Let's move on to the people standing in front of those buildings. Springfield has a population problem, and the problem is that it keeps growing without anyone noticing. When the show began, there was a family and a handful of supporting characters. A boss, a bartender, a neighbor, a teacher. That was roughly the size of the world, and it was drawn small because the show was small. Then it kept running, and every episode needed people to fill rooms, and the people who filled those rooms started to accumulate. A face drawn once to stand in a crowd would appear again the following season because reusing a design is cheaper than making a new one. And then again. And then the character would say, a line. And then the line would be funny. And then they would have a name. That is how Springfield was built. Not by design, by accumulation. The town's population is essentially a collection of accidents that stayed. Tonight I want to walk you through the strangest of them, and through the hidden rules that govern who gets to exist in the background of this show. Let's start with the two men at the bar. If you look at Moe's Tavern in almost any episode, there are two men sitting at the counter who are not Homer, not Barney, not Lenny, not Carl. They are two ordinary-looking men, one heavier and balding, one thinner with dark hair. They are there constantly. They have been there since the beginning. They have names. Internally in the production, they are called Sam and Larry, and they almost never speak. That is their function. They are furniture with faces. They exist so that the bar looks like a bar rather than a room containing only the cast. And because they exist, they have accumulated a strange kind of presence. They have been in the background of hundreds of scenes. They have witnessed everything that has ever happened in that bar. They were there for every one of Homer's crises. They were there for every prank call. They were there when the bar was renovated into something else and then renovated back. They have no interior life that the show has ever revealed, and yet they have more screen time than most characters in television history. Every time you see Moe's Tavern, look at the back of the bar. They will be there. Not doing anything, just there. Two men who have been drinking in the same room for 36 years. Now let's talk about the man who suffers. There is a small, elderly, extremely fragile man in Springfield who exists primarily to be destroyed. He is nearly blind, he moves very slowly, and the physical world treats him with a violence that would be unbearable if he were not a cartoon. He gets hit by vehicles, he gets crushed, he falls into holes, he is buried, he is set on fire, he is swept away, he is eaten. He is, by any reasonable count, the most frequently harmed character in the history of American animation. And here is the detail that makes him one of the great Easter eggs of the show. He once stated his age. In an episode, in dialogue, this man says how old he is, and the number is 31. 31. Look at him. He appears to be somewhere north of 80. He has the physical presentation of a man who has been alive for a very long time, and according to the show's own dialogue, he is younger than most of the writers who created him. The show delivers this and moves on. It is a joke about a sad little man having a sad little life, but once you have heard it, you cannot unhear it. Something in that town aged a man of 31 into a walking ruin, and the show has never offered an explanation, and it never will. There is also the question of his surname, which is a small piece of production history worth knowing. The character was named after a real person connected to the show's early days, and the name was chosen as an in-joke. Half of the audience heard a nonsense name. The people in the room heard somebody they knew. That is a category of Easter egg that runs through the entire series. Enormous numbers of Springfield's residents are named after real people. Writers named characters after their old teachers, their neighbors, their friends, their college roommates. Streets in Springfield are named after streets in the creator's hometown. The show is riddled with private references that mean nothing to us and mean everything to somebody. Let's talk about the man who cannot catch a break. There is a character in Springfield who arrived relatively late, in the middle seasons, and who was designed from the start as a tribute to a specific piece of cinema. He is a failing salesman. He is always about to lose everything. He speaks in a wheedling, exhausted, apologetic register, and he calls himself old before anyone else does. That character is a direct riff on a performance from a famous film about desperate real estate salesmen, in which a legendary actor plays a man at the absolute end of his career, begging for leads, humiliating himself for scraps. The Simpsons took that performance, dialed the pathos up, and put him in the background of a car dealership. And then something happened that the writers did not fully plan. He kept appearing, and every appearance made his situation worse. He has held dozens of jobs across the run of the show, and he has failed at all of them. He has lost homes. He has been rejected constantly. He is, in cumulative terms, the most tragic figure in the town. He is also, reliably, one of the funniest, which is a very strange thing for a show to achieve. Now, the man in the bee costume. There is a character on Springfield's Spanish-language television channel who dresses as an insect and is repeatedly injured for comedic purposes. He speaks in exclamations. He is a broad parody, and for years American audiences read him simply as a joke about foreign-language television. He is, in fact, a specific reference. He is modeled on a genuine and enormously beloved character from Mexican television, a costumed hero created by a comedian whose work was watched by hundreds of millions of people across Latin America for decades. That character wore a costume with antennae. That character was small, well-meaning, and constantly hurt. Which means that for a very large portion of the world, this background character is not a random gag. He is a recognizable homage, and the joke lands entirely differently. The show contains, in its background, an affectionate tribute to a piece of culture that most of its American audience has never encountered. That is my favorite kind of Easter egg, the kind that is invisible to one audience and obvious to another. Let's talk about the lawyer with blue hair. There is an attorney in Springfield who appears whenever a legal proceeding is required. He is unctuous. He is unprincipled. He is willing to represent anyone. He wears glasses and has a very particular hairstyle. He was reportedly based in design and manner on a real and notorious American lawyer, a figure from mid-century politics known for aggressive tactics and a general absence of scruple. The resemblance is not subtle if you know the face. And having spotted it, you cannot watch a courtroom scene in Springfield the same way again. This is a pattern. Springfield's institutions are staffed by caricatures of real people, and the caricatures are frequently very pointed. The town's news anchor. The town's mayor, whose voice and manner and personal appetites are modeled on a specific American political dynasty. The town's celebrity chef. The town's talk radio host. The show built a functioning town by borrowing the real world's faces and painting them yellow. Now let's discuss the rule about who gets to speak. There is an unwritten hierarchy in Springfield, and you can observe it in any crowd scene. At the front are the characters with names and voices. Behind them are the characters with names who rarely speak. Behind them are the characters with recognizable designs and no names. And at the very back are the generic townspeople. But here is the thing. The generic townspeople are not generic. The animation department maintains a library of background character designs, and those designs get reused constantly, which means the same anonymous faces appear again and again in different contexts. The same woman who is a customer in one episode is a nurse in another. The same man who is a spectator at a sporting event is a mourner at a funeral. Fans have tracked this. There are people who have identified specific background designs and mapped their appearances across the entire run of the show, producing accidental biographies of characters who were never intended to have one. There is a man who appears in crowds who has been documented in dozens of episodes across decades, always in the background, never speaking, occupying an entirely different social role each time. If you take that seriously as canon, Springfield contains a person who has held 40 jobs and attended every public event in the town's history without saying a word. Let's talk about the family in the pews. Church scenes in Springfield are among the most densely populated in the show, and the congregation is consistent. The same people sit in the same places. There are running background gags in that church that persist across seasons. Somebody is always asleep. Somebody is always visibly uncomfortable. There is a specific arrangement of families that has been maintained by the layout department with a diligence nobody asked for. The school assembly scenes have the same property. The students of Springfield Elementary are a fixed population, and they sit in consistent groupings. There are children in that school who have never had a line of dialogue and have appeared in more episodes than most guest stars. And then there are the teachers, who are perhaps the saddest population in the town. The faculty of Springfield Elementary appears in the background of staff room scenes, and if you read their body language, the show is telling you a great deal. There are teachers in that room who have visibly given up. There are teachers who are drinking. There are teachers who are grading with their eyes closed. None of it is dialogue. All of it is drawn. The show did produce episodes about the misery of that faculty, but the background art was making the same argument continuously in every scene set in that building, for years before and years after. Now, the animals. Springfield has a background animal population, and it follows the same rules as the human one. The family dog and the family cat are characters. But there are other animals who recur without explanation. There is a bird that appears. There are the animals at the zoo, which is a facility whose signage and conditions are alarming. There are the animals in the pet shop, whose proprietor is one of the show's more unsettling minor figures. And there is the fish. Everyone knows about the three-eyed fish. He is possibly the single most famous piece of visual shorthand the show ever produced, a mutation so iconic that it escaped the show entirely and became a general cultural symbol for industrial pollution. What people forget is that he was named and that he came back. That fish has recurred. He has appeared in the background of scenes long after his own episode. He is a documented, recurring resident of the town's waterways, and every appearance is a quiet reminder that nothing about that original problem was ever fixed. Let's talk about the character who exists only in a freezer. There is an elderly man in Springfield with a long white beard who, in one episode, climbs into a supermarket freezer to be cryogenically preserved. He is discovered later, still in there, frozen solid, and the store simply markets him as an attraction. He stays in that freezer for a while, and then he is out of it, with no explanation, appearing in scenes as normal. His beard, which had grown enormously during his time in the ice, returns to its usual length. Nobody says anything. That is one of my favorite abandoned threads in the show, because it was not abandoned by accident. The writers clearly enjoyed the frozen version. They kept him frozen for several appearances as a background gag, letting people spot him in the store. And then they got bored and thawed him, which means there is a period of episodes spanning multiple stories in which one of the town's residents is visible in a supermarket freezer in the background if you happen to look. Now, the squeaky-voiced teenager. There is a character in Springfield with an unfortunate voice and terrible skin who works at every single minimum wage job in the town. He is at the fast food restaurant. He is at the cinema. He is at the amusement park. He is at the video store. He is at the phone bank. He is at the theme restaurant. The joke is that he is the town's entire youth labor force, one kid, every job, simultaneously, as far as the show is concerned. But the deeper joke, and the one the show plays straight, is that he never gets anywhere. He works constantly and remains exactly where he started. He is the youngest member of the town's permanent underclass, and the show has been showing you his working life for 3 decades without ever once giving him a break. There is an episode in which his mother appears, and the exchange is one of the most quietly devastating small moments in the show. Let's talk about the running gag characters whose entire existence is a single joke. There is a man who appears in courtrooms and public gatherings whose function is to react. There is a woman who appears to scream. There is a character in the crowd whose sole purpose is to say the obvious thing that nobody else will say. There is a character whose entire personality is that he is very tall. These are joke delivery mechanisms with faces. And over enough years, joke delivery mechanisms with faces become people. That is the mechanism by which Springfield became one of the most fully realized fictional towns in any medium. Not through world-building documents, through the sheer weight of repetition. Draw a face enough times and the audience will build a life for it whether you intended one or not. Now here is the thing I find most remarkable about Springfield's background population. Its size. Estimates vary, but the number of named characters who have appeared in The Simpsons runs into the hundreds. If you include unnamed but recurring designs, the number goes considerably higher. There is no other narrative work in television with a comparable cast, and there are very few in any medium. You could reasonably compare it to the great 19th century novels, the ones with character indexes at the front because the reader will otherwise get lost. Springfield has a comparable population, developed over a comparable span of time, and the difference is that in this case the author is a rotating committee of several hundred people, none of whom has read all of it. That is an extraordinary thing to have happened by accident. And it produces genuine Easter eggs. Because with a cast that size, the writers can reach back and pull out somebody from 20 years ago and the audience will feel the click of recognition. A character who appeared once, in one scene, in 1992, will walk through a door in 2019, and a small number of people watching will make a noise out loud. The show does this deliberately. There are episodes constructed almost entirely around deep-cut cameos. There are crowd scenes that have been assembled specifically so that people can pause and identify everyone. And there are jokes that only work if you know the entire history. There is a category of gag in the later seasons that assumes an audience with a 30-year memory, which sounds like a mistake, commercially. It is not, because that audience exists, and it is very loud on the internet, and it has made the show immortal. Let me leave this section with one more figure. Somewhere in the crowd scenes of Springfield, in the back, in almost every large gathering, there are people who have never been named, never been designed as characters, and never been intended to matter. They are the fill, the bodies that make the room look full. Some of them have been in the background of this show since the first season. They have watched a nuclear plant leak for 36 years. They have watched their town be destroyed and rebuilt. They have been present at every riot, every parade, every disaster, every reset. They have never spoken. They have never been given a name. And they are, statistically, the longest-serving residents of the most famous fictional town in the world. Somewhere in the crowd behind Homer Simpson, there is a person who has seen everything and said nothing for 3.5 decades. Think about that while you drift off. Let's move on to something entirely different and considerably more mathematical. Here's a fact that changes how you watch this show. The writing staff of The Simpsons has, over the years, included multiple people with advanced degrees in mathematics and the physical sciences. Not people who liked maths at school, people with doctorates, people who published papers, people who left genuine research careers to write jokes about a yellow man falling down a hill. One of the show's long-serving executive producers holds a degree in mathematics from Harvard. Another writer, who went on to co-create a famous science fiction cartoon, has a background in physics and computer science. Another holds a doctorate in applied mathematics and once published a theorem that he invented specifically to solve a plot problem in a cartoon episode, which is possibly the only time in history that a genuine mathematical proof has been produced to serve as a joke about body swapping. Put a room full of people like that on a comedy show for 30 years, and something is going to leak. What leaked is one of the strangest hidden layers in the entire series. Buried in the background art, on chalkboards, on stadium scoreboards, in throwaway dialogue, there is a running thread of genuine mathematics. Real, checkable, sometimes quite advanced, placed there by people who knew that essentially nobody would notice and who did it anyway. Tonight, let's notice. We begin with the most famous one, and it is a beauty. In one of the Halloween specials, there is a segment in which Homer falls through a hole in reality and ends up in a three-dimensional space. It was a landmark piece of animation, one of the earliest uses of computer-generated imagery in the series, and it looks like a green grid with floating geometric shapes. Those floating shapes are not decorative. Drifting through that void, visible for a couple of seconds each, are pieces of mathematics. There is a shorthand statement of one of the most famous unsolved problems in computer science, an expression about whether two classes of problem are equivalent. That question is, at time of writing, still open. It carries a substantial prize. It has occupied some of the finest minds in the field for half a century, and it is floating in the background of a Halloween cartoon. There is also an equation, and this is where it becomes genuinely remarkable. The equation appears to state that a particular number raised to the 12th power added to a second number raised to the 12th power equals a third number raised to the 12th power. If that were true, it would be one of the most significant results in the history of mathematics, because it would disprove a theorem that had stood as a conjecture for over 350 years and had only recently been proved when that episode aired. The theorem in question states roughly that for any power above 2, you cannot find three whole numbers where the first raised to that power plus the second raised to that power equals the third raised to that power. It was scribbled in the margin of a book in the 1600s by a French lawyer who claimed to have a proof and did not have room to write it down. It tortured mathematicians for centuries. It was finally proved in the 1990s, after years of work, in a proof running to over 100 pages. And in the middle of that decade, a cartoon put a counterexample in the background of a Halloween special. The numbers do not actually work. Of course they do not. But here is the trick, and it is the reason this Easter egg is legendary. The writer who created it, a man with a serious background in computer science, wrote a program specifically to search for a near miss. He wanted a set of numbers where the two sides of the equation were so close that a standard pocket calculator would round them to the same value. He found one. The numbers agree to a large number of digits. If you punch them into an ordinary calculator, the display runs out of room before the discrepancy shows up, and the calculator tells you the equation is true. So there was a period, after that episode aired, in which viewers with a mathematical bent typed the numbers into their calculators, saw the equation appear to hold, and briefly experienced a moment of genuine vertigo. That is an Easter egg that required original computational research to construct, placed in a cartoon, for the benefit of an audience of possibly a few thousand people, none of whom the writer would ever meet. And he did it again. In a later episode, an entirely different near miss appears on a blackboard, in a different context, with different numbers, constructed the same way. The second one fails a simple parity check, which means a sharp observer can disprove it faster. Some people have suggested this was deliberate, a slightly easier puzzle offered as a follow-up. The same blackboard in that episode contains other things. There is an equation that, according to those who have analyzed it closely, amounts to a prediction of the mass of a fundamental particle. That particle had been theorized for decades but had not been experimentally confirmed at the time the episode aired. Its confirmation, at a laboratory in Europe, came many years later, and it was one of the great scientific events of the century. The value implied by the cartoon blackboard is not exactly correct. It is in the right general neighborhood. Whether that constitutes a prediction or a coincidence depends on how generous you are feeling, and the writers themselves have been fairly modest about it. But the fact remains, there is a blackboard in a cartoon about a man trying to invent things in his garage, and on that blackboard, alongside a joke about donuts, there is a serious attempt at particle physics. The same blackboard contains a piece of topology concerning the shape of the universe, and a diagram that plays with the idea of a donut shape as a cosmological model. That is a joke about the character's food obsession. It is also, in a very loose sense, a real idea, because cosmologists have genuinely considered whether the universe might have a shape with a hole in it. The writers were, essentially, doodling. They were doodling in a language most of the audience cannot read. Now let's go to the stadium. There is an episode set at a baseball game, and at one point the crowd is invited to guess the attendance figure. 3 numbers appear on the scoreboard as options. Those 3 numbers are not random. The first is a perfect number. A perfect number is a number whose divisors, excluding itself, add up to itself. They are rare, and they have fascinated mathematicians since antiquity. There are only a handful of small ones. The second is a prime of a particular special type, named after a 17th century French monk, which are the primes that show up in the search for the largest known primes to this day. The third is a narcissistic number, which is a number that can be written as the sum of its own digits, each raised to some power. These are curiosities, mathematical toys, the sort of thing you find in recreational number theory books. 3 numbers on a scoreboard, on screen for a few seconds, each one a different species of mathematical rarity, sitting side by side. That is not an accident. That is somebody in a writer's room saying, what if we made the attendance options interesting, and everybody else in the room understanding immediately what was meant? Let's talk about pi. There is a joke in the show about a character reciting pi to a very large number of decimal places and stating what the final digit is, which is, on its face, absurd, because pi does not end. But the show has used pi more carefully elsewhere. There is a scene in which a scientist gets the attention of a hall full of scientists by declaring a false value for pi, and every head in the room turns. That is a joke that only works if you understand that the people in the room would find that statement physically painful. And there is an episode involving a character who, in the course of a plot about intelligence, produces mathematical work that is either genuine or a very convincing imitation of genuine. Let's talk about the first episode of the entire series that had a mathematics joke, because it establishes the tone early. Very early in the run, there is an episode about the family's son being placed in a school for gifted children. In the classroom, the children are working on a problem, and there is an exchange involving a piece of calculus notation. The joke is a pun that requires you to know how derivatives are written. That is in the first season, before the show had established anything about itself. The staff was already assuming an audience that had taken calculus. Now, let's talk about why this matters beyond trivia, because I think there is something genuinely lovely underneath it. There is a widely held belief that popular entertainment must aim at the middle, that if you put something difficult in a mass-market product, you will lose the audience, and the audience will feel excluded, and they will leave. The Simpsons is one of the largest counterexamples in the history of that argument. The show put genuinely obscure material into a program watched by tens of millions of people. Not occasionally, constantly. References to 19th century literature, to opera, to obscure films, to mathematics, to physics, to art history, to political theory. And the audience did not leave. The reason it works is a matter of structure. The difficult material is never load-bearing. You do not need to understand the equation to enjoy the scene. The scene works entirely on its own as a man in a green void looking frightened. The equation is a bonus for the people who can read it, and it costs the people who cannot absolutely nothing. That is a design principle, and it is worth thinking about. Layer your work. Make the surface complete. Then bury things underneath for the divers. Almost nothing in modern entertainment does this anymore, and it is one of the reasons this show still has an audience that pauses frames. Now, let's talk about the people responsible, because they deserve names, and because their stories are lovely. The writer's room of The Simpsons in its strongest period was staffed overwhelmingly by graduates of one particular university's humor magazine, an institution that has functioned as a pipeline into American comedy for generations. And that magazine, at that university, attracted an unusual mixture of people. Some were English majors, a striking number were not. There was a period in which the room contained several people who could have been doing serious research and were instead arguing about whether a joke should land on the second or third beat. One of them, before joining the show, had done work in theoretical computer science. Another had worked in physics. Another had a doctorate in applied mathematics and had, in a previous life, published in a technical field. The story about the theorem is the one that always stops people. On the sister show created by some of the same people, a science fiction cartoon set 1,000 years in the future, there was an episode built around a machine that swaps two people's minds. The machine has a limitation. It cannot swap the same pair twice, which means that once a group of characters have all swapped around, getting everyone back into their own bodies becomes a genuine puzzle. The writers wrote themselves into a corner. They needed to know whether it was always possible to return everyone to their original body, given the constraint, and if so, how many extra people you would need to bring in to do it. So one of the writers, the one with a doctorate, sat down and proved it. He produced an original mathematical result, demonstrating that any such permutation can be resolved with the addition of two outsiders. The proof appears in the episode. It is written on a whiteboard, on screen, in a cartoon, and it is real. That theorem has since been discussed in mathematical literature. It has a name that references the show. It is, as far as anyone can tell, the only genuinely novel mathematical theorem to have been created for the purpose of resolving a plot hole in an animated comedy. That is the culture those people came from, and that culture is all over The Simpsons. Let's talk about the numbers that recur. There are numbers in Springfield that appear more often than chance would predict, and tracking them is a small pleasure. The family's house number is a specific figure that has been almost entirely consistent, with a few deviations in early episodes, and the odd continuity slip. It appears on the door, on mail, on the curb. The power plant sector designation, where Homer works, is a specific alphanumeric that recurs constantly and has become one of the show's most recognizable pieces of shorthand. There are recurring joke numbers in the show's license plates, in its telephone numbers, in its prices. Telephone numbers in American television must use a reserved exchange to avoid connecting real people, and the show has used that constraint as a joke source repeatedly, with the remaining digits carrying gags. There is a number associated with the town's secret society that has become a fan touchstone, referring to a member's rank within a hierarchy that is explained in an episode with more precision than the plot required. And there is a running joke about a very large number of documented workplace errors attributed to a single employee, delivered as a specific figure, which is exactly the kind of detail that turns a joke from funny into memorable. Specificity is funnier than vagueness. Every comedy writer knows this. The show applies it relentlessly. Now let's go somewhere slightly different and talk about the show's relationship with science more broadly. Springfield contains a scientific establishment. There is a research facility. There is an observatory. There is a professor at the local university whose demeanor is a caricature of academic obsession and whose inventions frequently work. That professor's laboratory, in the background, contains equipment and diagrams. And those diagrams are drawn with an unusual degree of care. There are periodic tables that are legible. There are anatomical charts. There are formulae on whiteboards that are, at minimum, syntactically plausible. There is an episode involving a scientific conference, and the posters on the walls of that conference have titles. The titles are jokes, but they are jokes constructed in the exact register of real conference posters, which suggests somebody in the writing staff had attended one and remembered the experience with some bitterness. The show's treatment of astronomy is similarly careful. There is an episode involving a comet, and the celestial mechanics in it are approximately correct, which is more than can be said for most disaster films. And there is the episode in which a character builds a device, and the schematics on the wall behind him are detailed enough that people have attempted to interpret them. Let's talk about one specific and rather beautiful example of the show hiding a real idea in a joke. There is a moment involving the concept of a shape with a particular topological property, and the joke depends on understanding that a coffee cup and a donut are, to a topologist, the same object, because each has exactly one hole and one can be deformed into the other without tearing. That is a genuine and famous idea in mathematics. It is the kind of thing that gets explained in the first week of a topology course, and the show uses it as a visual gag about a man who is thinking about food. The audience laughs at the man thinking about food. A much smaller audience laughs at the topology. Neither audience is shortchanged. Now, I want to close this section with the thing that I think is actually the most extraordinary fact in it. None of this was ever announced. The show never made a fuss about its mathematics. There were no press releases. There were no interviews at the time saying, "Look what we hid." The equations went out on network television and sat there, undiscovered for years. The famous near-miss equation was noticed by mathematicians relatively quickly because mathematicians watch television too, and the news spread through a small community by word of mouth. But the full extent of the mathematical content in the show was not assembled and documented until decades later, when a science writer sat down and went through the entire run, episode by episode, cataloging everything, and published a book about it. That book exists. It is a real book, written by a serious author on science, and it consists entirely of an examination of the mathematics hidden in an animated sitcom. It interviews the writers. It explains the jokes. It goes deep into the number theory. Somebody wrote a book about the arithmetic in a cartoon, and that book was reviewed in serious publications, and it sold. That is what happens when you spend 30 years hiding things for divers. Eventually, somebody brings scuba gear. Here's what I want you to take with you into the next section, as you get comfortable. Somewhere in a room, a long time ago, a man who could have been proving theorems for a living wrote a computer program to find a pair of numbers that would look, on a cheap calculator, like they had broken a 300-year-old theorem. He did this so that a shape could float past in the background of a Halloween cartoon for about 2 seconds. He knew almost nobody would see it. He knew that of those who saw it, only a fraction would recognize it. He knew that of those who recognized it, only a fraction would bother to check. He did it anyway. Because it was funny, and because the small number of people who would get it were worth the effort. That is the entire spirit of the Easter egg. A gift left in a place where it will probably never be found by somebody who enjoyed hiding it more than they would have enjoyed the credit. There is a lot of that in this show. Let's go and look at the films now. If you removed every film reference from The Simpsons, you would remove somewhere in the region of a quarter of the show. That is not an exaggeration. The series is constructed on a foundation of cinema. Its shot compositions borrow from famous films. Its editing rhythms borrow from famous films. Its plots are frequently restagings of famous films with the roles handed to cartoon characters. And beneath all of that, in the background of scenes that are about something else entirely, there are hundreds of visual references that flash past in a second. The people who made this show were, above everything, obsessive watchers of movies. Many of them were the kind of person who had seen a particular film 40 times. And when you get a room full of people like that, and you give them a weekly cartoon and almost no supervision, what you get is a 36-year-long love letter to 20th century film. Tonight we go looking for it. Let's start with the horror. There is an episode, part of the show's Halloween tradition, that restages one of the most famous horror films ever made. A family goes to a remote hotel as caretakers for the winter. The father begins to lose his mind. The child has a psychic ability. There is a hedge maze, a bartender who may not exist, a woman in a bathtub, and a door. The Simpsons version compresses the entire film into roughly 7 minutes, and it does so with a fidelity that goes far beyond parody. The camera moves are the same camera moves. The tracking shot down the corridor behind the child's tricycle is recreated in animation, with the same low angle and the same relentless glide. The title cards are the same. The color palette is the same. The moment where the father's writing is discovered is staged identically, right down to the framing of the pages. That segment is one of the most beloved things the show has ever produced, and part of the reason is that it was made by people who genuinely loved the original. It is not mocking. It is recreating precisely and then putting a stupid person in the lead role. That is the show's key technique with film references, and it is worth stating plainly. The Simpsons does not usually parody films by pointing at what is silly about them. It reproduces them faithfully, and then introduces one incompatible element. The comedy comes from the collision of a perfect recreation with a wrong ingredient. Let's talk about the master of suspense. There is more of that particular director in this show than of almost any other filmmaker. His influence is everywhere. There is an entire episode built around a boy with a broken leg watching his neighbor through binoculars and becoming convinced he has committed murder. That is a direct restaging of one of the director's most famous films, and the episode follows the plot beats with real discipline, including the climax. There is a sequence involving birds. There is a shower scene, staged with the same rapid cutting and the same shrieking strings. There is a motel with a very particular silhouette on a hill behind it, appearing in the background of scenes that have nothing to do with that film. That last one is the classic move. The house on the hill behind the motel is drawn into background art in multiple episodes as a purely visual reference, present for anybody who recognizes the silhouette and invisible to everybody else. There is a spiral staircase shot that recreates the famous dolly zoom vertigo effect, and the show does it in animation, which is technically much harder than doing it with a camera and considerably more impressive than it looks. And there is the director himself, who appears in the show as a caricature, in keeping with his famous habit of appearing briefly in his own films. Which means The Simpsons made a cameo joke about a man famous for cameos, which is exactly the sort of layered reference the show specializes in. Let's talk about the film that everybody quotes and almost nobody has fully watched. There is a citizen of Springfield who is a very old, very rich man with a mansion, a gate, a fortune built on ruthlessness, and one treasured object from childhood that he lost. That is a direct and sustained homage to what is frequently called the greatest American film ever made. The parallels are extensive and deliberate. The gate with the warning sign, the vast, cold house filled with objects, the newsreel-style biography, the political ambitions, the failed marriage, the associates who abandon him, and, most famously, the object from childhood, which in the film is a sled and in the show is a stuffed bear. The episode that deals with the bear is one of the show's finest, and it plays the ending almost completely straight. There is a moment near the conclusion, involving an incinerator, that is lifted directly from the film's final shot, and the show does not undercut it. It lets it land. Which means that in the middle of a cartoon about a donut-eating idiot, there is a genuinely moving recreation of one of cinema's most famous endings, performed by a stuffed animal. Now, the gangsters. Springfield has organized crime, and its organized crime is a running homage to two specific film traditions. There is the operatic, family-centered tradition, and there is the fast, funny, brutal tradition that came later. The town's crime boss is designed and voiced to evoke a particular register of cinematic gangster, and his lieutenants have the names and manners of characters from those films. There are scenes staged as direct restagings, there is a restaurant sequence, there is a car boot. There is a moment involving a bakery, and there is a recurring joke that the show plays extremely well, which is that these characters are entirely aware they are cinematic archetypes and behave accordingly. They speak in the cadence of the films. They understand their own genre. Let's talk about the science fiction. There is an episode in which the family's father goes to space, and that episode contains one of the show's most sustained homages to a monumental film about human evolution and machines. The docking sequence is recreated with the same waltz on the soundtrack. The interior of the craft echoes the film's design. There is a moment involving a floating object that plays the original film's sense of awe absolutely straight before puncturing it. And there are references to the film's central computer, its voice, its eye, and its slow menace, scattered through multiple episodes across decades. There is a robot in Springfield. There are references to a film about a dystopian future with a particular kind of rain. There are references to time travel films, to alien invasion films, to films about apes. The apes deserve a special mention because the show did something extraordinary with them. There is an episode in which the town stages a musical adaptation of a famous science fiction film about a planet ruled by primates. The musical numbers were written for the episode. They are genuinely good. And the final reveal of the film, its famous twist, is delivered as a show-stopping song. That musical has taken on a life of its own. People perform it. People know the lyrics. A parody of a 1960s science fiction film, performed as a fictional Broadway show inside a cartoon, is now a genuine cultural artifact that people sing at each other. Now let's get to the deep background, the references that are not episodes but single frames. This is where the real Easter egg hunting happens. When a scene is set in a cinema in Springfield, the posters on the wall are jokes about real films. When a character rents a video, the shelves behind them are stocked with fictional titles that reference real ones. When somebody turns on a television, the film playing is a version of something. There are shot compositions in ordinary episodes that quote famous films for no reason at all. A character will walk down a corridor and the framing will be a quotation. A crowd will part in a particular way. A door will open onto a particular arrangement of light. Animators did this because they enjoyed it and because they could. Nobody in the audience needs to notice. But the person storyboarding that scene had watched a lot of films, and when they needed to draw a man walking into a room, they drew it the way their favorite director would have shot it. There is a category of reference in the show that concerns the Western. Springfield's relationship with the American Western is complicated and constant. There are standoffs staged in the main street. There are saloon doors. There is a recurring visual grammar of the frontier applied to entirely domestic situations. There is a reference to a famous film about a group of men escaping from a prison camp, staged in a nursery school, with a toddler in the role of the escape artist. That sequence is a masterpiece of compression. It takes a 3-hour war film and performs it in 90 seconds with babies, complete with the famous motorcycle jump, the famous ball against the wall, and the famous score. That is arguably the single greatest film reference the show ever made, and it is a subplot in an episode about something else. Let's talk about the thriller with the boat. There is a recurring antagonist in Springfield, a highly educated man with an enormous head of hair and a beautiful voice, whose entire character is an homage to a specific kind of cultured villain. And the episodes built around him are, almost without exception, film parodies. One of them restages a famous thriller about a released convict stalking the family of the man who put him away. That episode uses the original film's score, arranged by the show's composer, and the score is not a parody. It is played with genuine menace. The episode is genuinely tense in places, and it contains one of the most famous physical comedy sequences in television history, involving a series of garden tools and a man stepping on all of them in a row. That sequence is worth talking about on its own, because it is an Easter egg about comedy itself. The gag is that the character steps on a rake, it flips up and hits him in the face, and he makes a noise. Then he does it again, and again, and again. It goes on for a very long time, far past the point where it is funny. Then it continues past the point where it is uncomfortable, and then, somewhere on the far side of that, it becomes funny again, in a completely different way. That is a deliberate structure, and the writers have discussed it. The scene was reportedly extended specifically to fill time in an episode that was running short. So the funniest sustained gag in the show's history exists because of the same runtime problem that produced the couch gag tradition. The show's constraints kept generating its best material. That happens more often in creative work than anyone admits. Let's talk about the episode that is entirely constructed out of another film's architecture. There is an episode in the middle seasons that abandons the show's usual structure completely. Instead of one story, it tells a series of short, interconnected vignettes about different residents of the town, with characters wandering in and out of each other's stories, and the chronology folded so that events appear out of order. That structure is borrowed from a celebrated independent crime film of the same era, and the borrowing is explicit. There is a diner. There is a conversation about the names of fast food items in another country. There is a moment involving a bathroom that mirrors a running motif from the original. But the episode also does something the original did not. It uses the structure to make an argument about the town itself. By following the residents rather than the family, it demonstrates that Springfield is a place with a life of its own, that the Simpsons are not the center of it, and that every background character you have been ignoring for years is having a full day. That episode also contains the scene that has, decades later, become possibly the most memed sequence in the entire history of the series. Two men, a lunch, a lie that spirals, a house fire, and a conversation conducted entirely in escalating implausibility while a kitchen burns. That scene was, at the time, a minor subplot in an experimental episode. It is now studied. People have made films about it. People have recreated it, shot for shot in live action. It has been analyzed as a piece of comic structure in ways its writers surely never anticipated, which raises an interesting point about Easter eggs generally. Some of them are placed deliberately. Others are created retroactively by an audience, deciding that a particular thing matters. The show did not hide anything in that lunch scene. The internet found it and made it a treasure anyway. Let's talk about the musicals. The Simpsons has an enormous debt to the American musical, and the references run deep. There are entire episodes built around parodies of specific stage shows. There is a recurring device in which the town breaks into song for a civic purpose, most famously in an episode about a proposed transportation project, whose song has been sung at real municipal meetings by real people opposing real infrastructure proposals. That is a genuine phenomenon. Councilors and campaigners have quoted that song in actual public consultations. A cartoon parody of a musical number about a public transit project has entered the vocabulary of real urban planning debates. There is an homage to a famous film about a magical nanny, in which the show invented its own version of the character with a name that is a legally cautious near miss of the original. That episode's songs are structurally identical to the film's songs, and one of them has a devastating final verse about the character's function in the family's life. There is a reference to a musical about a certain confection factory. There is a reference to a musical about revolutionaries in Paris. There are references to the Great American Songbook scattered through episodes in the form of tunes that characters hum without comment. Now, let's discuss the composer, because he is the hidden hero of every film reference in the show. For a very long stretch of the series, the music was written by a single composer working with a large orchestra, which was itself unusual for television animation at the time. Most cartoons used small ensembles or synthesizers. This one used a full band, every week, for decades. And that composer was a genius at pastiche. When the show referenced a film, he would reference the film's score, in the correct style, in the correct orchestration, sometimes quoting specific melodic ideas closely enough to be recognizable and distinctly enough to be legal. So, a sequence that visually quotes a film is often simultaneously quoting the film's music in the background, at a volume most viewers do not consciously register. It is a second layer of reference laid underneath the first, and it is why so many of the show's parodies feel right in a way that is difficult to articulate. If you go back and listen to the score in isolation, which people have done, you find an extraordinary catalog: spy music, horror music, Western music, sweeping romantic strings, big band, Baroque pastiche, all of it produced weekly, to deadline, for a cartoon. The show also uses source music as a reference tool. When a specific song appears in a scene, it is frequently there to trigger a memory of the film that used it first. Let's talk about the shot-for-shot recreations, because they are the highest form of this practice. There are moments in this show where the animation reproduces a live-action shot with a precision that only makes sense if somebody had a videotape running in the room while they drew. There is a sequence recreating a famous shot involving a slow push-in on a face. There is a recreation of a famous overhead shot of a crowd. There is a recreation of a famous sequence involving a spinning corridor, which in the original was achieved with an enormous rotating set, and in the cartoon was achieved by drawing it, which is somehow both easier and harder. There is a recreation of the ending of a famous film about a woman and her friend and a cliff, and the show plays it entirely straight until the last possible second. And there is a category of homage that is even more specific, which is the recreation of a film's title sequence. There are episodes that open with parodies of famous main title designs, complete with the correct typography, the correct animation style, and the correct musical cue. Typography is the giveaway. If you watch closely, the show frequently references films through their fonts. A title card will appear in a particular typeface, and that typeface is the reference. Nothing else in the frame indicates it. Somebody in the production simply knew that a specific film used a specific lettering style, and they used it, and about 400 people noticed. Let's finish this section by talking about why the film references work, because I think there is a genuinely interesting principle underneath them. Most parody ages badly. Parody depends on the audience knowing the original, and originals fade. A show packed with references to the films of a particular decade should be almost unwatchable 30 years later. The Simpsons is not, and the reason is that the references are almost never the joke. Take the horror parody. If you have never seen the original film, the segment still works. A man goes mad in a hotel and chases his family. That is a complete story. The reference adds a layer of pleasure for the initiated, and its absence costs the uninitiated nothing. Take the gangster material. If you have never seen the films, you still have funny criminals. That principle is the entire reason this show survived. Its jokes are built so that the reference is a bonus, never a requirement, which means the show is legible to a viewer in 2026 who has seen none of the films that inspired it, and simultaneously bottomless for a viewer who has seen all of them. It also means that watching this show is, for a certain kind of person, an education. There are people who first encountered the great films of the 20th century as cartoon parodies, and who went and found the originals afterwards because the parody was so affectionate that it advertised its source. A cartoon about a stupid man taught a generation of children about a century of cinema, sideways without any of them noticing they were learning. That is the deepest Easter egg in this entire section. The show hid an entire film curriculum inside itself and then handed it to children. Let's move on now to the darkest corner of the town. Let's go to the graveyard. Once a year, this show stops being itself. The Halloween episodes operate outside the rules. Characters die permanently within a segment. Reality collapses. The animation style changes. The show becomes, briefly, a horror anthology with a sense of humor, and it uses that freedom to do things it could never do in a normal week. And because the Halloween episodes are exempt from continuity, they became the show's densest concentration of hidden material. When nothing counts, you can put anything anywhere. Let's walk through the traditions, because almost every element of these episodes carries a buried joke. We begin with the credits. Starting from the second of these specials, the show established a tradition of altering everybody's name in the credits to something spooky. The creator's name gets a horrifying middle name. The producers get horrifying middle names. The writers, the animators, the composer, the voice cast, all of them are rechristened with a gruesome variant. Those variants are jokes, and many of them are quite good. They are puns on the person's real name. They are references to horror films. They are occasionally insults that the person presumably approved. That tradition ran for years and became one of the small pleasures of the specials. If you paused the credits, you got an additional 40 jokes that nobody in the audience was expected to read. Then there is the opening. In the early years, the Halloween specials opened in a graveyard. The camera would drift over headstones, and each headstone would carry a name, and each name would be a joke. This is one of the great Easter egg troves in the show's history. Some of the tombstones bore the names of real people, usually with a joke attached about their careers or their public image. There is a famous one concerning a musician who was, at the time of the joke, extremely alive, and who reportedly found it amusing. There are headstones bearing the names of abstract concepts. There are headstones for things that had recently ended in the culture. There are headstones for genres, for trends, for fads. There are headstones referencing the show's own characters. There are headstones referencing the show's own canceled ideas. And there is a strain of headstone joke that is genuinely melancholy, because it names things that had died in the culture and would not come back. A dance craze, a format of media, a style of music. Reading those graves now, decades later, they land differently. They were jokes about the present. They are now epitaphs that turned out to be accurate. The graveyard opening was eventually retired, as most of the traditions were, but it produced dozens of buried gags. Then there is the tradition of the introduction. Early specials were introduced by a host. There were versions in which one of the characters addressed the audience directly and warned them that what followed would be frightening. There were versions where the introduction was itself a parody of a famous horror anthology's framing device. There were versions where the host was killed during the introduction. That framing device is itself a reference. Anthology horror on television has a long tradition of hosts who appear to introduce and comment, and the show is quoting a specific lineage. Now let's talk about the segments, and specifically about the hidden material inside them. There is a segment in which the family's father sells his soul for a donut. It contains one of the show's most famous images, a room of ironic punishment. And if you look at the background of that room, you will find details that are considerably more disturbing than the foreground joke. There is a segment set in a haunted house where the house itself is a character, and the interior design of that house is packed with visual references to horror films of several eras. There is a segment involving a genie, and the wishes made in that segment produce a version of the town that appears in the background with an alarming level of detail. There is a segment involving time travel, in which a device sends the father backwards, and the alternate presents he creates on his return are each visible for only a few seconds. Those alternate presents are among the most heavily analyzed frames in the entire series, because each one implies an entire history. There is a version where the town's social structure has been reorganized. There is a version involving a very small change with enormous consequences. There is a famous version involving a family dinner that is almost perfect, ruined by a single detail on the table. Each of those alternate worlds is a fully designed universe glimpsed for 3 seconds. Somebody drew each one. Somebody made decisions about what the wallpaper looked like in a reality that would exist on screen for less time than it takes to sneeze. Let's talk about the segment where the show went into 3 dimensions. There is a famous sequence in which one of the characters steps through a wall into a computer-generated space. It was, at the time, a genuinely significant technical achievement for a television cartoon, produced with the help of a specialist studio, and it cost a great deal of money. We have already discussed the mathematics floating in that void. But there is more in there. There is a teapot. If you look carefully at the objects drifting through that space, one of them is an ordinary teapot. That is not a random choice. That teapot is one of the most famous objects in the history of computer graphics. It is a standard test model, digitized in the 1970s from a real teapot bought in a shop, and it has been used ever since by graphics researchers as a benchmark object. It appears, as an in-joke, in an enormous number of computer-animated productions. Its presence in that void is a wink from the animation team to every other animation team on Earth. A professional handshake hidden in a Halloween cartoon. The sequence ends with the character emerging into live-action footage of a real street, which was a genuinely startling image in the mid-90s and remains strange now. A cartoon character, rendered in 3 dimensions, standing on a real pavement outside a real shop, looking around. That shop was a real business. People have gone and found it. Let's talk about the tradition of adapting literature. The very first of these specials ended with an adaptation of a famous 19th century poem about a bird, and the adaptation is remarkably faithful. It uses the original text, largely unaltered, read aloud by a narrator with a magnificent voice, while the animation illustrates it. That was an astonishing thing to put on network television in a primetime animated comedy in 1990. Several minutes of American romantic poetry, unedited, performed straight, with a cartoon dog as the protagonist's companion and a cartoon child as the bird. Generations of American students have encountered that poem first through this cartoon. Teachers have used the segment in classrooms. A show about a man strangling his son introduced an enormous number of children to one of the canonical works of American literature and did it well. The specials returned to literature repeatedly afterwards. There are adaptations of short stories, of classic novels, of famous plays. There are references to the great cosmic horror tradition, with tentacled entities and unpronounceable names appearing in the background of segments that are ostensibly about something else. Let's talk about the hidden jokes in the segment titles. Each Halloween special is divided into segments, and each segment has a title card. Those titles are puns, almost always puns on the film or story being parodied, adjusted to include a character's name or a Springfield reference. Reading a list of those titles is a small pleasure of its own. Some of them are groaners. Some of them are so tortured that the effort involved becomes the joke. And a small number of them are genuinely elegant, where the pun is so clean it improves on the original title. Now let's talk about the deaths. The Halloween specials kill characters. Frequently. Permanently. Within the segment. And because the specials are exempt from continuity, the show can kill anyone. There is a running tradition of killing the entire main cast at least once per special. There are segments that end with the total destruction of the town. There are segments that end with the destruction of reality. And there is a tradition of extremely dark endings in which the segment does not resolve. The horror wins. The characters remain trapped, or transformed, or dead, and the credits roll over their misfortune. That is an unusual thing for a comedy to do. And it is one of the reasons these episodes have such a strong hold on people who watch them as children. There is a specific feeling produced by a familiar, safe cartoon suddenly refusing to fix things at the end. A lot of people remember exactly where they were sitting when a Halloween segment did not have a happy ending. Let's talk about the food. There is a segment about a certain kind of consumption that has become notorious, and its final image is one of the most disturbing things the show has ever produced. It plays as a joke and functions as a nightmare. There is a segment involving a substance that transforms people. There is a segment involving a school lunch program. The Halloween specials have a persistent thematic interest in eating, and once you notice it, you cannot stop noticing it. The show is quietly obsessed with the idea of a population being consumed by something, and Halloween is where it lets itself say so. Let's talk about the alien visitors. There are 2 recurring extraterrestrial characters who appear in essentially every Halloween special, whether or not the segments require them. They are green, they have 1 eye each, they drool, and they have been part of the tradition since the very first one. Their appearances are, in themselves, an Easter egg hunt. In specials where they are not part of the main story, they will appear somewhere, in the background, in a crowd, in a single frame. Finding them has been a viewer sport for decades. Their names are jokes. Both of them are named after figures from classical mythology, which is a peculiar choice for a pair of drooling monsters, and exactly the sort of detail that suggests somebody in the writing room had a very good classical education and nowhere else to use it. There is a running joke about their relationship to each other, which has been implied, contradicted, and re-established across many specials. And there is a genuinely famous political segment involving them, in which they replace two candidates during an election, and the segment ends with a line about the two-party system that has been quoted in actual political commentary ever since. That segment aired in the mid-90s. It has been referenced in every American election cycle since. Let's talk about the traditions that were abandoned. The Halloween specials used to air before Halloween. Then, because of scheduling, they began airing after Halloween, which the show has repeatedly complained about within the episodes themselves. There are jokes about the specials arriving in November. There are jokes about them arriving in December. The show has used its own Halloween episodes to publicly grumble about its own network scheduling, which is an extraordinary thing to be allowed to do. The graveyard opening was dropped, the credit name tradition was dropped, and occasionally revived. The warning to the audience was dropped. Each abandoned tradition left a residue of buried jokes that only exist in a specific window of seasons, which means Halloween specials from different eras have completely different sets of Easter eggs. If you were to watch all of them in order, you could date any given special to within a few years purely by its structural furniture, without seeing a single frame of the segments. Let's talk about the one Halloween tradition that never went away. The show still does these, every year, for more than 3 decades. And in recent years, the specials have become something quite different from what they were, because the show has started using them as a place to do genuinely ambitious things. There have been Halloween specials that abandoned the anthology format entirely and told a single story. There have been specials produced in radically different animation styles. There have been specials that function as extended homages to particular filmmakers, with those filmmakers involved. And there has been at least one that operates as a piece of genuine, sincere horror, with jokes present but not dominant, which is a remarkable thing for a show in its 4th decade to attempt. Which brings me to the thing I want to leave you with about the Halloween specials. They are the show's release valve, and every long-running work needs one. The Simpsons, in its normal weekly form, is constrained. Nothing can change, nobody ages, nobody dies, nothing has consequences. The reset button is pressed at the end of every episode, and the family is back on the couch on Sunday. That constraint is what keeps the show alive commercially, and it is also a cage. Halloween is the 1 week a year when the cage opens. Characters can die. Time can pass. The town can be destroyed and stay destroyed until the credits roll. The animation can become something else. The tone can turn genuinely bleak. And because the writers know that everything resets afterwards anyway, they use that week to say things they cannot say in October the rest of the year. That is why the Halloween specials are so densely packed with hidden material. It is not just that the format permits it. It is that everybody involved knows this is their one chance, and they cram it full. Somewhere in a room, every year for 36 years, a group of people have sat down and asked each other what they would do to this family if they were allowed. And then they have done it, for 22 minutes, and put it on television between advertisements for cars and breakfast cereal. And the following week, the family is back on the couch, unharmed, remembering nothing. That is its own kind of horror, and I do not think the show has ever fully acknowledged it. Let's go somewhere quieter. Let's go inside the house. The most familiar building in the world is a 2-story house in a town that does not exist. More people could sketch the layout of the Simpson family home than could sketch the layout of their childhood school. It has been on screen for more hours than almost any other domestic space in the history of the medium. And it is riddled with hidden details, impossibilities, and quiet jokes that have been sitting in plain view for decades. Tonight, let's go through it room by room. Start outside. The house is pink. That is a decision worth pausing on. In a suburb full of beige and gray and pale blue, the family lives in a pink house. Nobody in the show has ever remarked on it. It was a design choice made early to make the house distinctive against the background art, and it produced a home that would be, in any real neighborhood, a source of ongoing conversation. The house number appears on the wall by the door. It has been consistent through most of the run, though very early episodes and a handful of later ones show different numbers. And the show has occasionally made a joke of the inconsistency. The address is one of the show's most recognizable pieces of information. It appears on mail, on packages, on documents. And it has become one of those rare fictional addresses that people can recite, alongside a certain detective's rooms in London and a certain wizard's cupboard. The mailbox is worth watching. It changes. It is destroyed regularly and replaced. The tree in the front garden has a swing. That swing has appeared and disappeared over the years, occasionally in the same episode. Now, let's talk about the neighbors, because the geography of the street is one of the show's more consistent achievements. The house next door belongs to a family whose patriarch is defined by relentless cheerfulness, and their house is designed as a deliberate contrast. It is better maintained. The garden is tended. The exterior is a more respectable color. When you see the two houses side by side, the show is making an argument without dialogue. On the other side is a different neighbor, and across the street are others, and the show has maintained a broadly consistent map of that street for decades. Now let's go inside. The front door opens into a hallway. There is a staircase. There is a coat rack. There is a small table. And on the wall, going up the stairs, there are pictures. Family photographs. Framed. Look at them when the camera passes. The photographs change. They show moments from episodes. They show moments that were never episodes. Somebody in the background department has been quietly curating the Simpson family photo album for 36 years, and almost nobody has ever looked. Turn right into the living room. The couch. The most famous piece of furniture on Earth. It is orange, and it has been orange since the beginning, and it has been destroyed, replaced, stolen, eaten, animated, exploded, and restored more times than anyone has counted. Behind the couch, on the wall, there is a painting. That painting is one of the great hidden jokes of the series. It is a picture of a sailboat. It is unremarkable, slightly bland, exactly the sort of picture a family with no strong feelings about art would hang above a sofa. The show has, over the years, given that painting a surprising amount of attention. There is an episode that addresses its origin. There are jokes about its quality, and there is a running background gag in which the painting subtly changes between shots, sometimes within the same scene, sometimes in ways so slight that only people watching frame by frame notice. That painting has been the subject of genuine fan research. People have cataloged its variations. Somebody has almost certainly written a thesis. Next to the couch is a lamp. In front of the couch is a coffee table. On the coffee table, at various points, there have been things worth reading. The television sits opposite. That television is the family's altar, and it deserves its own paragraph. The design of the set has changed across the run, updating from a boxy tube television to flatter, more modern designs as the world updated around it, which is one of the very few ways the show acknowledges the passage of real time. The characters do not age, the house does not change, but the television gets thinner. Whatever is on that television is always a joke. There are entire programs that exist only as things playing in the Simpson living room. There is a cartoon within the cartoon, a violent series about a cat and a mouse, which functions as the show's ongoing commentary on its own medium, and which has produced some of the most extreme animation ever broadcast in primetime. That cartoon within a cartoon has its own history, its own creator, its own studio, its own merchandising, and its own episodes with titles. It is a fully realized fictional franchise nested inside a real one. Now go through to the kitchen. The kitchen is where a great deal of the show's best writing happens, because it is where the family talks, and it is dense with detail. There is a refrigerator, and the refrigerator has things stuck to it. Children's drawings, notes, photographs, magnets. Those things change constantly and are almost never mentioned. There is a spice rack, there is a window over the sink, there is a table with 4 chairs and a high chair, and there is the telephone on the wall, which in the early seasons was a rotary or wall-mounted model with a cord long enough to reach anywhere in the house, and which is the site of dozens of jokes. The kitchen cabinets contain products. Those products have brand names, and the brand names are inventions. There is an entire fictional grocery economy visible in that kitchen if you look at the labels. Now, the basement. The Simpson house has a basement, and the basement is one of the great continuity problems of the series. It appears when the story needs it, and vanishes when it does not. Its contents change entirely between appearances. It has been a workshop, a storage space, a laundry room, a bomb shelter, and on at least one occasion something considerably stranger. The same is true of the attic, which likewise appears on demand, contains whatever the plot requires, and has been accessed by different means in different episodes. And the garage. The garage is the most unstable room in the house. Its size fluctuates dramatically. Its contents are inconsistent. In some episodes it houses a car. In others it houses an entire workshop with heavy machinery. In at least one, it houses something that could not possibly fit. Fans have attempted to produce a coherent floor plan of the Simpson house, and it cannot be done. The rooms do not fit together. The upstairs has more space than the downstairs. Windows appear on walls that back onto other rooms. Doors open onto corridors that should not exist. There is a genuine tradition of people building models of the house, drawing plans, constructing it in video games and in architectural software, and every single one of them has to make choices, because the source material contradicts itself constantly. That is not sloppiness exactly. It is a consequence of how animation is made. Each episode is boarded by different people, and the house is drawn to serve the shot. If a scene needs a longer corridor, the corridor gets longer. Nobody is checking against a master plan, because for most of the show's history there was no master plan, which means the Simpson house is a building that exists in a superposition of every version of itself that has ever been drawn. Let's go upstairs. The children's bedrooms are the most heavily decorated rooms in the house, and they are the best character work in the entire production design. The boys' room is chaos. There are posters, there are toys on the floor, there is a bed that is rarely made, and the posters are jokes. They advertise bands that do not exist, films that do not exist, and a particular clown-branded product line that dominates his consumer identity. His room contains a substantial amount of merchandise related to a comic book superhero who exists within the show's universe, and that superhero has his own elaborate fictional history, complete with a publication timeline, era-appropriate art styles, and a controversial sidekick. The girls' room is different in every respect. It is tidy. There are books, there is a saxophone, there are posters, and her posters are of jazz musicians, of scientists, of activists. The contrast is the joke, and the show made it in season 1 and has maintained it with absolute discipline ever since. 2 children, 2 rooms, and everything you need to know about both of them visible on the walls. The parents' bedroom is comparatively bare, which itself says something. There is a bed, there is a wardrobe, there is a dresser. There is very little that expresses personality, and the show has occasionally noted this in episodes about the mother's suppressed ambitions. The baby's room contains a mobile, a cot, and a set of stars painted on the wall, and it is the calmest room in the house. Now, let's talk about the thing that makes this house genuinely extraordinary, which is that somebody built it. In 1997, a promotional competition was run in the United States by the show's network in partnership with a large beverage company. The prize was a house, not a model, not a replica facade, an actual full-sized habitable house constructed in a real housing development in Nevada, built to match the Simpson family home as closely as physically possible. It was real. It had the pink exterior, it had the orange couch, it had the sailboat painting above it, it had the boys' bedroom with the posters and the girls' bedroom with the saxophone, it had the kitchen with the correct cabinets. The design team went through episodes frame by frame and reproduced what they saw, resolving all the impossibilities with judgment calls. Around 1,500 separate items were sourced or custom-made for the interior. The colors were matched to the animation. The whole thing cost a substantial amount of money and took most of a year. And then they gave it away. The winner was selected at random from an enormous pool of entries. She was a woman who, by most accounts, was not a particular fan of the show and had not knowingly entered. Her name had been submitted through a promotion she had participated in. She was offered a choice: take the house or take the cash equivalent. She took the cash. The house was then repainted in ordinary colors, the interior was stripped of its cartoon features, and it was sold as a normal home to a normal family, who presumably had no idea what they were buying. That house still stands. People go and look at it. From the outside, it is now an entirely unremarkable suburban house in Nevada, and the only clue is the shape of it, which is subtly wrong in a way that most people cannot place. There is something almost unbearably poignant about that story. The most famous house in the world was built, in reality, once, and the person who won it did not want it, and it was painted over. Let's talk about the objects. There are objects in the Simpson house that have their own histories, and tracking them is one of the great pleasures of a deep rewatch. There is a chair that the father sits in, and its condition degrades and restores across the run. There are children's drawings that appear on the refrigerator and later reappear in other contexts. There is a family portrait, painted at one point in the series, which subsequently hangs in the house and is visible in later episodes, which means that an event from one episode left a permanent physical mark on the set, and the background artists honored it for years afterwards. That kind of persistence is much rarer in this show than people assume, and each instance of it is genuinely touching. In a series built on forgetting, somebody in the art department decided that this one thing would be remembered. There is a rug in the living room whose pattern is consistent. There is a set of curtains that the mother made. There is a spice rack, mentioned earlier, that becomes a plot point in an episode about a marriage under strain, and which afterwards continues to sit in the kitchen as an artifact of that story. Let's talk about the car. The family car is pink, dented, and older than most of the audience. It has been destroyed many times. Its model is a fictional make, and that make has been the subject of jokes. The car's interior contains objects, its boot contains objects. Its glove compartment has been opened on screen, and its contents are jokes. And there is a running detail about the car's radio and what is playing on it, which is a small, reliable source of hidden gags across the run. Now, let's talk about something I find genuinely moving about this house. It is a small house. Look at it properly. It has 3 bedrooms and 1 bathroom for a family of 5. The kitchen is modest. The garden is modest. There is no home office, no second bathroom, no guest room, nothing that indicates wealth. And the family is, in the show's own terms, financially precarious. The father's income is unstable. There are episodes about missed payments, about the mortgage, about the near loss of the house. The family is 1 bad month away from serious trouble at any given moment, and the show has said so repeatedly. Which means the most famous home in the world is a house that a lot of people watching cannot afford. It was drawn in 1989 as an unremarkable, slightly shabby example of ordinary American housing, the kind of place a nuclear plant worker with a high school education and 1 income could reasonably own. That is no longer a plausible economic proposition in most of the country, and it has not been for a long time, which means the Simpson house has slowly become an aspirational object without changing at all. It stayed exactly where it was, and the ground moved under it. There is a genuinely widespread conversation about this now. People point at that house and say, a man with no qualifications and 1 job supported a family of 5 in that, and it was drawn as a joke about mediocrity. The show did not intend that. It could not have. It was simply drawing the middle, accurately, in 1989, and the middle drifted away and left the picture behind. That is the largest Easter egg in the entire series, and nobody hid it. It was hidden by time. Let's finish this section with the back garden. There is a treehouse. It is in the back garden, in the tree, and it is where the boy retreats. It has been the site of many episodes. It gives its name to the Halloween tradition, which was originally framed as stories told in that treehouse. It is badly built. It has a rope ladder. It has a sign. And it is, in a show full of impossible architecture, the one structure that has remained essentially consistent. A small wooden box in a tree, in a garden, behind a pink house, at a specific address, in a town that does not exist, in a country that has changed enormously around it. Everything in that house has been redrawn thousands of times by hundreds of artists. The building has no coherent floor plan. Its rooms appear and disappear. Its contents shift. And yet you know exactly what it looks like. You could walk through it in your head right now, from the front door to the kitchen to the stairs. You know where the bathroom is. You know which side the boy's room is on. That is a genuinely astonishing feat of design. A building that is architecturally impossible and completely, permanently memorable. Sleep in it tonight if you like. There is a couch. Let's talk about language next. A cartoon changed the English language. That is a strange sentence, and it is true. There are words in circulation today, used by people who have never seen this show, which were invented in a writer's room in Los Angeles as jokes and then escaped into general use. Some of them are now in dictionaries. Not slang dictionaries, actual dictionaries, with etymologies that credit an animated sitcom. Tonight, let's go through the vocabulary. We begin with the most famous, which is a single syllable. The father's exclamation of frustration is now a recognized word in the Oxford English Dictionary. It has an entry. It has a definition. It has a pronunciation guide. Its etymology traces to the show, and specifically to a decision made by the voice actor in a recording session. The story behind it is lovely. The scripts originally called for an annoyed grunt, written phonetically as a long, drawn-out sound. The actor decided that was too slow for animation timing and shortened it into the sharp, clipped noise we all know. It was quicker to say and funnier to hear, and it stuck. That sound has since become one of the most recognizable vocalizations on Earth. It is used by people in countries where the show has never been popular. It has been translated into dozens of languages, with each dubbing team having to solve the problem of what their version of that noise should be, and the solutions are fascinating. Some languages kept it. Some invented something local. Some had to build a new word from nothing. And in the scripts for decades, it was never written out. It appeared in the text as a stage direction, an instruction to make the annoyed sound, because the sound belonged to the performer rather than the page. Now let's go to the two words that ended up in dictionaries as genuine additions to the language. In an episode about the town's founder, we learn that Springfield's official motto contains a word that appears to mean to make bigger. A teacher hears it and remarks that she had never encountered that word before moving to the town. Another teacher replies that it seems like a perfectly acceptable word, except she does not say acceptable. She uses a different word, one that also does not exist, an invented adjective meaning valid or fine. So in a single exchange, the show invents two words, uses one to comment on the other, and constructs a joke about how language is legitimized purely through confident usage. Both words have since entered actual dictionaries. Think about how that happened. A joke about an invented word, which was a joke about the arbitrariness of vocabulary, became so widely used that lexicographers had to acknowledge it, thereby proving the joke correct. The show made an argument about how words get accepted, and then the argument tested itself in the real world and won. The first of those words has been used in serious contexts. It has appeared in academic writing, it has appeared in journalism, it has been used by people who are entirely unaware of its origin, which is the surest sign that a word has properly naturalized. The second one, the adjective, is now used constantly online, generally by people who do know where it came from, as a kind of secret handshake. Now let's talk about the shortened name. There is a moment in an episode set at an amusement park in which a child cannot find a personalized souvenir with his name on it because his name is unusual. The rack of items is full of a slightly different name, and the boy's despair at this is a small and perfect joke about the specific childhood misery of having a name nobody stalks. That slightly wrong name has taken on an enormous afterlife. It appears in the background of other episodes. It appears on merchandise. It has become shorthand among fans for a particular kind of near miss. And it has produced a genuine real-world phenomenon, in which people have named children, pets, businesses, and software projects after a joke about a novelty license plate. Let's talk about catchphrases, and specifically about the ones the show later regretted. The boys' catchphrases in the early 90s were an industrial phenomenon. They were printed on millions of t-shirts. They were banned in some schools. They were the subject of newspaper editorials about the decline of youth. And within a few years, the show had visibly grown tired of them. There are episodes in which characters complain about the phrases. There are episodes in which the phrases fail to work. There is a general drift away from them as the writing matured, and by the middle seasons they had largely been retired, deployed only occasionally and usually with an ironic frame. That is an unusual thing for a commercial property to do. Those phrases were selling merchandise. The show got bored and stopped saying them anyway. There is a whole category of catchphrase in Springfield that belongs to minor characters, and those have proven far more durable. The doctor with the accent has a greeting that has outlived most of the show's other coinages. The clerk at the convenience store has a phrase of ironic gratitude. The bar owner has a particular way of answering the telephone. The school groundskeeper has an entire dialect. That last one deserves a moment. The groundskeeper's speech is a heightened, largely invented version of a Scottish accent, and the show has built an enormous number of jokes on it. The character has, at various points, been given dialogue so dense with regional inflection that other characters cannot understand him, which is itself the joke. And the show has occasionally hidden real information inside that dialogue, on the assumption that nobody would parse it closely enough to notice. Now, the misheard lines. There is a rich tradition of lines in this show that huge numbers of people quote incorrectly, and the incorrect versions have become more famous than the originals. This happens because animation dialogue is delivered quickly, because the audio mix is dense, and because for the first 15 years of the show, most people were hearing it once, on broadcast, with no way to check. There are famous lines where the actual wording differs from the popular version by a word or two. There are famous lines that people attribute to the wrong character. There are famous lines that never appeared in the show at all and were invented by the audience, passed around, and gradually accepted as canon. That last category is genuinely fascinating. A show this widely quoted eventually accumulates apocrypha, lines that everybody remembers and nobody can find, scenes that people describe in detail and that do not exist. There is a body of scholarship, largely conducted by amateurs on forums, dedicated to tracking down these phantom quotations and establishing whether they are real. Let's talk about the show's treatment of names. Springfield's characters have names that carry enormous amounts of hidden information. Many are named after real streets in the town where the show's creator grew up. That is a well-documented and rather sweet piece of trivia. A significant portion of Springfield's population is named after the road layout of a city in the Pacific Northwest. The family's own surnames carry references. The mother's maiden name and her sister's names form a set. The father's name is a joke about a certain formality. The children's names include one taken directly from the creator's own family. And there is a running joke about the town's founder, whose name is a variation on a real historical figure and whose story is a parody of American origin mythology. The show also plays constantly with the naming conventions of institutions. Springfield's schools, hospitals, businesses, and municipal buildings are named after people, and those people have implied stories. A wing named after a donor. A school named after somebody whose reputation has since collapsed. A road named after a local hero whose heroism is questionable. Every one of those names is a story that the show declines to tell. Let's talk about the invented brands. Springfield's consumer economy runs on invented brand names, and those names are constructed with real skill. The best of them sound exactly like real brands, which is why so many of them have been mistaken for real products by people watching in other countries. There is a beer brand that dominates the town's supply, and the show has built out that brand extensively. It has variants. It has advertising campaigns. It has a mascot. It has a theme park. It has a history involving the founding family, revealed in an episode that gives it more backstory than most real breweries publish. That beer has been produced in reality on multiple occasions under license, sold in various markets, and has been the subject of legal disputes about whether a fictional beer, known primarily to children, should be a real beverage. There is a fast food chain with a clown mascot, and that chain's menu, advertising, and corporate history have been developed across dozens of episodes. There is a soft drink, a snack food line, a cigarette brand, a car manufacturer, an airline, a bank, and a chain of convenience stores, all invented, all consistent, all developed over decades. Springfield has a functioning fictional economy with named participants, and that economy was built entirely out of throwaway gags. Let's talk about the show's approach to foreign languages. There is a Spanish-language television channel in Springfield with its own programming, its own stars, and its own conventions, and the show has treated it with more affection than most American programs have treated anything. There is a substantial thread of French in the series, including an early episode set in France in which the child protagonist learns the language over the course of a summer, and the animation quietly shows him becoming fluent. There is an episode set in Australia containing an enormous number of invented words, delivered so confidently that a significant number of viewers came away believing they were real Australian slang. There is an episode set in Japan, one in India, one in Brazil, one in Britain, one in Italy. Each of them generated its own set of language jokes, and several of them generated genuine international incidents, because a comedy that trades in national caricature will eventually annoy a nation. Now, let's talk about the show's own dubbing, because this is a hidden layer most English-speaking viewers never encounter. The Simpsons is broadcast in dozens of languages, and every one of those versions had to solve enormous problems. Puns do not translate. Cultural references do not translate. Character names carrying English language jokes do not translate. So the localization teams had to invent. In several countries, characters have entirely different names, chosen to carry equivalent jokes in the local language. In several countries, jokes were replaced wholesale with local equivalents. In some markets, entire episodes were reworked. There is a famous case involving a European version in which the show was dubbed into two separate versions of the same language for different territories, with different casts and different comedic sensibilities, and the two audiences developed fierce loyalties to their own version. There is a case in which a character's accent was changed to a regional accent from the dubbing country, which entirely altered how that character was perceived, and which produced a completely different set of jokes and a completely different cultural meaning. Which means that in a real sense, there are multiple different Simpsons. The show you know is one version of a work that has been reinterpreted dozens of times, and viewers in other countries have grown up with characters whose names, voices, and personalities differ from the ones you know. Somebody who loved this show as a child in one country, and somebody who loved it as a child in another country, can have an entire conversation about it and slowly realize they are describing different programs. Let's finish with the thing that I think is the most remarkable linguistic fact about this series. The show has produced a shared vocabulary that functions as a genuine cultural code. If you say certain phrases in the right company, in almost any English-speaking country, you will get a response. Not a laugh, necessarily. A recognition. The other person will complete the line, or produce the correct follow-up, or simply nod. There are not many works that achieve this. A handful of films, a few books, one or two other television programs. It requires enormous reach, enormous repetition, and writing sharp enough to be worth memorizing. And the shared vocabulary is not just quotations, it is a set of concepts. There are situations in life for which the only accurate description is a reference to something that happened in this cartoon. There are types of person best described by naming a Springfield resident. There are feelings for which the show provided the definitive image. That is what happens when a work runs long enough and is good enough for long enough. It stops being a program and becomes a language. And languages, once they exist, do not go away. They outlive their speakers. They get inherited. Children learn them from parents who learned them from a television. There are people alive today who quote this show fluently and have never watched a full episode. They absorbed it from the environment, the way you absorb idioms whose origins you never learned. That is immortality of a very particular kind. Not the show being remembered, the show being spoken. Let's move on. I want to tell you about the things hidden inside the characters themselves. There is a signature hidden in Homer Simpson's head. You have been looking at it your whole life. The show's creator, when he designed the character, built his own initials into the face. The shape of the hairline forms one letter. The shape of the ear forms another. Turn the head to the correct angle and the letters are there, sitting on the side of the most recognizable cartoon face in the world. It is the kind of thing that, once you have been shown it, you cannot stop seeing. Every profile shot of that character becomes a signed painting. That trick is not unique to this show. Cartoonists have hidden their marks in their creations for as long as there have been cartoons. But there is something specific about hiding your initials in the face of a character who will be reproduced billions of times, printed on merchandise in every country, tattooed on people, painted on walls, and broadcast for 4 decades. Every single one of those reproductions carries the signature. Every t-shirt, every mug, every pirated frame, every meme. The creator's name has traveled further than any autograph in history, and almost nobody knows it is there. Tonight, let's go looking for the other marks the artist left. Let's start with the rabbit. Before this show existed, its creator drew a weekly comic strip. That strip was strange, funny, and quite bleak. Its cast included a one-eared rabbit, a family of rabbits, and a pair of men who appeared in matching shirts and had an ongoing and legally ambiguous relationship. Those characters have appeared in The Simpsons. The rabbit shows up, in the background, in a crowd, as a drawing on a wall, as a toy, as a shape in a pattern. He has been placed into episodes as a private joke for decades, and the practice began early. The two men have appeared as well, drawn in their original style, standing in a crowd of characters who look nothing like them. This is a specific and rather touching kind of Easter egg. It is the creator smuggling his older, less commercial, less profitable work into the enormous machine that his newer work became. A small reminder, hidden in the background of a global franchise, of the years spent drawing something nobody was paying much attention to. Let's talk about the animators' names. Storefronts in Springfield carry names, as we discussed earlier, and a large number of those names belong to people who worked on the show. Directors, layout artists, storyboard artists, background painters, timers, and production assistants have all had their names painted onto buildings in that town. Sometimes as a business, sometimes on a mailbox, sometimes on a gravestone in a Halloween special, which is a slightly more ambiguous honor. There is a long-standing practice in animation of naming background elements after staff, and it serves several purposes. It fills space quickly, because you already know the name. It rewards colleagues, and it creates a permanent record of who was in the building, which means Springfield is, among other things, a memorial. The names on those shops are the names of people who spent years of their lives drawing that town, some of whom have since died, and whose names remain on buildings that will be broadcast forever. There is one particular case that people find affecting. A member of the production died, and a business in Springfield was named after them, and that business continues to appear in the background of episodes decades later. New artists, who never met the person, keep drawing the sign because it is part of the street now. Let's talk about the deliberate errors. Animation is made under enormous time pressure, and errors happen. A character's clothing changes color between shots. An object appears in a hand that was empty. A background element is on the wrong side of the room. Most of these are simply mistakes, and the show has thousands of them, cataloged obsessively by fans. But some of them are not mistakes. There is a tradition in animation of the deliberate error, inserted by an artist as a private joke, sometimes to see whether anybody in the approval chain is paying attention, objects that should not be there, details that contradict the scene, small acts of vandalism committed inside one's own work. Those exist in this show, and identifying which anomalies are jokes and which are exhaustion is essentially impossible from the outside. There is also a category of error that became beloved and was therefore preserved. A character was drawn incorrectly once, the audience liked it, and the incorrect version became canon. A background element was misplaced, and then kept appearing in the wrong place because the artist found it funny. Let's talk about the freeze frame gags. This is a specific craft, and this show is arguably the medium's greatest practitioner of it. A freeze frame gag is a joke that exists on screen for so short a time that it cannot be read at normal speed. It is designed for the pause button. Before home video, this was a nearly pointless thing to do. You were writing jokes for an audience of essentially nobody, and the show did it anyway, constantly, from the very beginning, on the vague theory that it was funny to do. Then home video arrived, then DVDs, with frame-accurate stepping, then streaming, and 30 years of jokes that had been sitting unread suddenly became accessible. Watching a 90s episode with a modern pause function is like an archaeological dig. Documents that flash past for 4 frames turn out to contain entire paragraphs of comedy. Lists on walls turn out to have 20 items, of which 19 were never meant to be seen. Newspapers turn out to have full articles written on them. There is a famous instance involving a document that a character holds up briefly, and the text on that document is a complete, coherent piece of writing that the show never expected anyone to read. Somebody wrote it properly. Somebody drew it properly, and it was on screen for less than a second. That is a gift with no expectation of return, which is a decent definition of art. Let's talk about the recurring background objects. There are objects in Springfield that appear again and again in places where they do not belong. There is a particular painting that shows up in multiple buildings. There is a specific piece of furniture that recurs. There is a poster design that has been hung on the wall of a school, a hospital, an office, and a prison. Some of this is simple asset reuse. Animation studios maintain libraries, and reusing a drawn object is faster than making a new one. But over enough episodes, reuse becomes a running gag, and the artists began to lean into it, which means that if you track a single background object across the run of the show, you produce something that looks like a conspiracy and is actually a budget. Let's talk about the guest animators. We discussed the guest couch gags earlier, but the practice extends further. There are sequences within episodes animated by outside artists in radically different styles. There are dream sequences handed to specialists. There are segments in Halloween specials produced by different studios. Each of those is a small window into another artist's world, dropped into the middle of a show with an extremely fixed visual identity. And there is a related tradition of the show imitating other animation styles from within. There are sequences drawn in the style of specific classic cartoon studios, complete with the correct line work, the correct color, and the correct physical comedy timing. There are sequences that imitate stop motion. There are sequences that imitate the look of early hand-inked animation, complete with the flicker and the registration errors. Doing that well requires the animators to genuinely understand the style they are imitating and to be able to draw badly on purpose in exactly the right way, which is much harder than drawing well. Let's talk about the yellow. The single most consequential design decision in this show's history was made for a practical reason, and it produced the most recognizable color scheme in television. The characters are yellow. The decision was made during the show's earliest development, and the reasoning, as it has been recounted, was that a viewer flipping past the channel would see that color and stop, because nothing else on television looked like it. It worked. It worked so well that the color itself became a trademark. That particular shade is protected. It is used in the show's branding, in its merchandise, in its theme park attractions. There are people who see that yellow on a wall in a shop and know instantly what shop it is. And the decision produced a secondary effect that the show has quietly exploited for decades. Because the main cast is yellow, characters who are not yellow read as outsiders. The show uses skin tone as a signal of belonging, of celebrity, of otherness. Guest characters are sometimes drawn differently. Characters from outside the town look different. That was not planned. It emerged from a color chosen to attract channel surfers in 1989. Let's talk about the hair. The mother's hair is one of animation's great design solutions. It is a tall blue tower, and it exists because a tall blue tower reads instantly at any size, from any angle in any lighting. It also carries a hidden joke that the show has deployed twice. When her hair is down, it is enormous. When it is wet, it collapses, and there is an implication, made explicit in at least one episode, that she is going gray underneath and has been dyeing it for years. That is a small, devastating character detail hidden inside a design choice made for visibility. The children's hair is a similar case. The boy and the girl both have spiked hair, drawn as a series of points. Those points have a fixed count. Artists have to draw the right number every time, and getting it wrong is an error that fans will notice. There is a long-running discussion about exactly how those spikes are meant to work, whether they are hair or something more like a crown, and whether the girls are hair or an extension of her head. The show has joked about this. It has never resolved it. Let's talk about the mouths. There is a specific animation convention in this show regarding overbites, and it produces one of the medium's most flexible mouth designs. It allows for enormous expressive range with very few lines, which is what you need when you are producing 22 minutes of animation a week. And there is a rule about the eyes. The eyes are large white circles with small pupils, and almost all of the show's emotional acting happens in the relationship between those two elements. Move the pupil a fraction and the entire meaning of a shot changes. The best animators on this show are, essentially, expert pupil placers. That is the craft. 2 dots. Now let's talk about the model sheets and the rules nobody sees. Every animated show has model sheets, which are reference drawings showing exactly how a character should look from every angle in every standard expression. These are the law. They exist to keep the character consistent across hundreds of artists and multiple studios in different countries. The Simpsons has an enormous library of these, built up over decades, and they contain a great deal of hidden information. They specify things the show never says. Proportions. Relationships between characters' heights. The exact way certain designs work in 3 dimensions. Some of those sheets have been published in books, and they are genuinely fascinating documents. They show characters from angles that have never appeared on screen. They show expressions that were never used. They show the underlying geometry of faces that we only ever see from the front. There are model sheets for characters who appeared once. And there are model sheets showing early versions of designs that were later changed, which is a form of Easter egg in itself. You can see the show figuring out what its own characters look like. Let's talk about the very first appearances. Before the series existed, these characters appeared as short segments on a variety program. Those shorts are, by modern standards, extremely rough. The drawing is crude, the proportions are wrong. The voices are not quite right. The father sounds like a different man entirely. Those shorts are canon in a loose sense, and the show has referenced them. There are jokes in later episodes that only work if you know what the characters looked like at the beginning. And there is a specific hidden pleasure in the fact that the roughness was preserved. The show could have quietly buried those early shorts. Instead, they have been released, discussed, and celebrated. And the visible gap between the crude original and the polished modern version is part of the series' own mythology. Now, let's finish this section with the thing that I find most quietly extraordinary about the artists. The overwhelming majority of the drawing on this show was done by people whose names you do not know. The creator is famous. Some of the producers and writers are known. A handful of directors have profiles. But the enormous bulk of the actual drawing, the in-betweens, the backgrounds, the cleanup, the color, has been done by hundreds and hundreds of people, many of them working in studios on the other side of the world, on tight schedules, for wages that would surprise you. Those people made the show. every frame you have ever seen pass through their hands. And the Easter eggs are their voice. A writer can put a joke in the script. An artist cannot. An artist's only channel is the frame itself, the parts of it that nobody specified, the shop sign, the book title, the poster on the wall, the object on the shelf. So they used it. For 36 years, in every episode, anonymous artists have been leaving small jokes in the corners of a show that does not credit them individually, on the assumption that some of those jokes would eventually be found. They have been found. All of them, by now, probably. Every sign has been read and cataloged and posted online and laughed at by people who have no idea who drew it. That is the closest thing to a happy ending that this industry offers, and I think it is worth sitting with for a moment before you drift off. Somebody drew a tiny joke on a wall in the background of a scene about something else 30 years ago, and tonight somebody found it and laughed. The artist will never know, but it happened. Let's talk about what happened when this show escaped the television. Springfield stopped being a television town a long time ago. It is now a place you can physically walk through. It is a place you can play inside. It is printed on food packaging in supermarkets in countries where the show has never aired in English. And every one of those extensions carries its own layer of hidden material, some of it placed by people who never worked on the series at all. Tonight, let's follow the town out of the screen. We begin with the video games, because there have been a startling number of them. The earliest were made in the days when a licensed cartoon game was expected to be terrible, and most of them obliged. There is a home computer game from the beginning of the 90s in which the boy fights an alien invasion by spray painting purple objects, and it is famous now mostly for being extremely difficult, in ways that feel like punishment. There was an arcade cabinet, a side-scrolling brawler in which 4 players could take control of members of the family and beat their way across the town. That machine was enormously popular. It is remembered fondly, and it is packed with background detail, because the artists working on it had to draw Springfield from scratch at arcade resolution and use the opportunity to fill the streets with references. There were driving games, there were racing games, there were party games. There was a version that put the town into a fully explorable environment years before that was standard. And then, in the middle of the 2000s, there was the one everybody remembers. There is a game in which you drive around a properly realized Springfield, on foot or in vehicles, completing missions. It was heavily and openly modeled on a certain famous crime game series, transplanted into a cartoon town, and it worked far better than it had any right to. That game is a treasure box of hidden material. There are collectibles scattered across the map that reference specific episodes. There are vehicles from episodes that appeared once. There are buildings that only existed in a single scene, faithfully reconstructed and made enterable. There are jokes hidden in areas the player has no reason to visit. The developers were, evidently, fans. And when fans build something, they bury things. There are locations in that game which correspond to background art from episodes 10 years older. There are audio cues that quote specific moments. There are costumes that reference obscure appearances. For a certain generation, that game is where Springfield became a real place, because it was the first version you could walk around in and get lost in. People have spent hundreds of hours in that map. People have made careers out of documenting its secrets. Then there is the mobile game, which arrived in the 2010s and became one of the more successful things of its kind. That game is, structurally, a town builder. You reconstruct Springfield after a disaster, placing buildings and characters, and in doing so, it became the most complete inventory of the show's world ever assembled. Because to build the game, somebody had to catalog everything. Every building, every character, every vehicle, every landmark. The game contains hundreds of characters, including many who appeared in a single scene decades earlier, each with their own animations and dialogue. That is an extraordinary act of archival work disguised as a free-to-play game. If you want to know what exists in Springfield, that game is arguably the best reference document in existence, and it was assembled by developers going through 30 years of episodes with a notebook. The game also runs seasonal events, and those events reference specific episodes, sometimes very obscure ones. There are items in it that only make sense if you have seen a particular 7-second gag from the mid-90s. Now let's go to the theme park. There is a physical Springfield. 2 of them, in fact, at large American theme parks. You can walk down the street. You can eat at the fast food restaurant with the clown mascot. You can drink at the tavern. You can buy a donut of alarming size. And those locations are dense with Easter eggs, because the designers understood exactly what audience they were building for. The shop fronts carry names from the show, including deep cuts. The signage reproduces jokes from background art. The menus reference specific episodes. The music playing in the street is the show's score. The announcements over the tannoy are in character. There are details in those environments that reward a level of knowledge bordering on the unreasonable. There are references to businesses that appeared for 2 seconds in a single episode. There are posters recreating advertisements from background paintings. The ride itself is a simulator, and it is essentially a compressed anthology of the show's own tropes, with a plot involving the recurring criminal antagonist and a great deal of physical destruction. It is packed with visual gags that pass too quickly to catch, which is a very appropriate design decision. Before that ride existed, there was a roller coaster at the same park based on a different property, and the Springfield attraction replaced it. There is a memorial to the old ride hidden in the new one, which is the kind of detail theme park designers cannot resist. Let's talk about the film. The Simpsons made a feature film in 2007 after years of speculation, and the film is aware of its own status as an event. It opens with a joke about the absurdity of paying to see something you can watch at home. It contains a chalkboard gag about piracy. It contains a moment in which a character addresses the audience about the film's own structure. And it is stuffed with background detail because a cinema screen has far more resolution than a television, and the artists knew people would be looking. There are references throughout to episodes across the entire run. There are characters visible in crowds who have not appeared in years. There are signs carrying jokes that require substantial familiarity. The film also contains one of the great production Easter eggs, which concerns the number of writers. The script went through an enormous number of drafts over many years, and the writing credit is a long list of the show's most significant voices across its history. That credit is itself a document of the series' evolution. And there is the famous animal. A creature appears in the film, briefly, with a small musical number attached to it, and that character escaped the film entirely and became a cultural object in its own right. The song is short, it is very stupid, and it became, for a period, genuinely inescapable. That is an Easter egg in reverse, a tiny throwaway gag that grew larger than the work containing it. Let's talk about the comics. There has been a Simpsons comic book line for decades, published by a company founded by the show's creator specifically for that purpose, and those comics developed their own traditions. The most interesting is the superhero title. Within the show, there is a fictional comic book character, a superhero created by radiation exposure, who is beloved by the town's children. That character exists in the show as a joke about comic book history. And then the publisher made the comic, for real, as an actual periodical you could buy. That comic reproduces the fictional character's entire publication history, with issues drawn in the style of different eras. There are stories drawn to look like 1940s comics. There are stories drawn to look like 1960s comics, complete with the appropriate printing artifacts. There are stories parodying the grim, self-serious turn that superhero comics took in the 1980s, which means somebody produced a full pastiche history of American comic books as a licensed spin-off of a cartoon and hid an entire education in comics history inside it. There is also a running thread in the show itself about that character's sidekick, who is a deeply problematic creation and whose existence allows the show to make jokes about a specific and genuinely uncomfortable period in the history of the medium. Let's talk about the music. The show's theme was written by a celebrated film composer, and it is one of the most recognized pieces of music in the world. It has a peculiar structure. It uses an unusual scale that gives it a slightly off-kilter, carnival quality, which is precisely why it sounds like nothing else on television. Over the years, that theme has been rearranged constantly. There are versions in dozens of styles, performed by guest musicians, arranged for different genres, played on different instruments. Each rearrangement is attached to a specific episode and functions as a small joke about that episode's content. There are episodes where the theme is played in an unexpected style, and if you are not paying attention, you will miss it entirely. And there are the songs. This show has produced a genuinely substantial body of original music. There are numbers from the fictional musicals. There are jingles for fictional products. There are theme songs for fictional television shows. There are ballads. Several of them have escaped into the world. There are songs from this cartoon that people sing at each other, that get performed live, that appear on playlists. There is a song about a public transport proposal that has, as mentioned, entered the vocabulary of actual civic debate. There is a song about a musical adaptation of a science fiction film that is performed at conventions. There is a song about a fast food product that people quote in restaurants. Let's talk about the merchandise, and specifically about the strange things. In the early 90s, this show generated a merchandising phenomenon of a scale that is difficult to convey now. There were t-shirts everywhere. There were dolls, posters, lunchboxes, bed sheets, board games, and an enormous quantity of unlicensed material sold on street corners. The unlicensed material is its own subject. There is an entire folk art tradition of bootleg Simpsons merchandise, produced in various countries, in which the characters are redrawn from memory by artists with varying degrees of skill and placed in situations the show never depicted. Those bootlegs have become collectible. There are people who specifically seek out the wrong ones, the ones where the proportions are off and the colors are strange and the slogan makes no sense. That is Easter egg hunting in its purest and least official form, searching the world for accidental variations of a familiar image. And there were the records. In the early 90s, the show released music albums featuring the characters singing. One of the singles from those albums became a genuine international hit, reaching high positions on charts in multiple countries. A song performed in character by a cartoon child was a top-selling record. That happened. It is very easy to forget that it happened. Now let's talk about the deepest of all the real-world crossovers. There is a minor league baseball team in the American Southwest that changed its name in the early 2000s. The new name was taken directly from the show, referencing the Springfield team that features in several episodes. The name change happened after a public vote. It was chosen because a plot in the series had concerned that team's threatened relocation to a nearby city, and the joke had become locally beloved. So, a real sports franchise renamed itself after a cartoon joke about relocating a sports franchise. That team still plays under that name. Real athletes have real careers on a team named after a gag. There are other examples. There are streets named after the show. There are foods invented for the show that became real products. There are words that entered dictionaries, which we discussed. There is a species that got a scientific name referencing a character. The show has leaked into the world at every possible level, and every leak carries a small hidden joke that most people encountering it will never decode. Somebody buys a ticket to a baseball game and does not know they are watching a cartoon reference. Somebody uses a word in an email and does not know they are quoting a joke about invented vocabulary. Somebody eats a snack whose name came from a background sign. That is what happens when a work becomes large enough. It stops being a thing in the culture and becomes part of the culture's soil, and then things grow out of it that have no idea where they came from. Let's go back inside now. There is one more territory to explore, and it is the strangest of all. There is a category of hidden material in this show that is different from everything we have discussed so far. The signs and the equations and the tombstones were placed deliberately by people who knew they were placing them. This next category is stranger. These are the things that got left behind. Threads that were started and dropped, details that contradict other details, objects that appear once and are never explained. They are Easter eggs by accident. Nobody hid them. They simply fell into the cracks of a production that has run so long that no single human being has full knowledge of it. Tonight, let's go looking in the cracks. Start with the callbacks. The Simpsons has a reset button. That is well established. Each episode begins with the world restored, and events from previous episodes rarely carry forward. But not never. And the exceptions are precious. There is a small set of details that the show has chosen to remember, and remembering them requires deliberate effort from writers who were not there when the original episode was made. The family's dog has a history that has been maintained. The boy's ownership of certain objects has persisted. There are relationships between minor characters that were established once and honored afterwards. There are physical injuries that left permanent marks. There is a character who died, properly and permanently, in an episode that remains one of the show's most discussed. That death has been referenced repeatedly across the decades since. There is a grave. There is a legacy. The show has never pretended it did not happen. That consistency is remarkable precisely because the show owes us none of it. Nothing in the format requires the writers to remember a death from 30 years ago. They do it because somebody in the room cares. Then there are the threads that were dropped. The show has, over the years, introduced a substantial number of story elements that were clearly intended to matter and then simply stopped. There are characters who arrived with fanfare and vanished. There are relationships established and never mentioned again. There are professions that a character held for an episode and then forgot. There are enormous changes to the town's structure that lasted a single episode. There is at least one instance of a character being given a significant piece of backstory that directly contradicts backstory established earlier, and the show has never acknowledged the contradiction. There are multiple, mutually exclusive accounts of how the parents met. There are multiple accounts of the town's founding. There are multiple accounts of significant events in characters' lives. The show is aware of this and has made jokes about it, most memorably in an episode that addressed the shifting timeline directly and then moved on without resolving anything. That contradictory material is genuinely fascinating to sift through, because each version of a story tells you what the writers of that particular era thought the show was about. Early accounts of the parents' history are grounded and economic. Later accounts are more nostalgic. The most recent accounts are self-aware. The character has not changed. The lens has. Let's talk about the objects that appear once. There are things in Springfield that show up in a single scene and imply enormous amounts of off-screen life. There is a building that appears in the background of one episode with a name suggesting an institution the town should not have. There is a vehicle that appears once and is never explained. There is a document that a character reads with an expression suggesting something important, and we never learn what it said. There is a photograph on a wall in one episode showing an event we have never seen. Those single appearance details are the show's genuine mysteries, and they exist in a completely different register from the mysteries the show constructed deliberately. A deliberate mystery has an answer. These do not. Somebody drew a building, gave it a name because a name was needed, and moved on. The mystery exists entirely in the audience, which is, when you think about it, exactly how mystery works in the real world too. Most of the strange details you notice in your own town are not clues. They are the residue of decisions nobody remembers making. Let's talk about the characters who changed. Some residents of Springfield are unrecognizable from their first appearances. There is a character who began as a background figure with a completely different personality and voice, and who evolved over years into somebody quite specific. There is a character whose intelligence was originally presented very differently. There is a character who was originally menacing and became sweet. There is a character who was originally sweet and became menacing. Voices drifted too. Several of the show's most famous characters sound noticeably different in the first 2 seasons because the performers were still finding them. There are early episodes in which a character's voice is nearly unrecognizable to somebody who came to the show later. That drift is invisible if you watch in broadcast order over decades, and glaringly obvious if you watch the first season immediately after the 30th. The show has occasionally made jokes about it, with characters commenting on their own former selves. Let's talk about the abandoned formats. There are structural experiments in the show's history that were tried once and never repeated. There are episodes told in unusual chronological order. There are episodes with unreliable narration. There are episodes that break the fourth wall structurally, rather than in a single gag. There are episodes in which the show pretends to be a different kind of program entirely for its full runtime. There is an episode presented as a documentary about the show itself, in which the family are actors who became famous and then experienced a decline. That episode contains an extraordinary amount of buried material because it required the writers to invent an entire fictional history for their own program. There is an episode that is essentially a fake clip show. There are episodes constructed around unreliable retellings of the same event. Each of those experiments generated its own set of hidden details, and because they were one-offs, that material has nowhere else to live. It exists in a single episode and nowhere else in the canon. Let's talk about the guest stars who were not announced. The show has an enormous history of celebrity guest appearances, and most of them are heavily publicized. But there is a quieter tradition of guests who appeared without fanfare, sometimes uncredited, sometimes as unnamed background voices. There are episodes in which a very famous person delivers 2 lines as an anonymous character, and the credit is buried. There are episodes in which a musician performs a piece of incidental music without acknowledgement. There are episodes in which a famous director voices a background figure. Identifying those is a genuine hobby. People go through episodes listening for familiar voices in crowd scenes. There is also the reverse tradition, in which the show's regular cast voice guest characters. The core voice cast of this show handles an astonishing number of roles, and a substantial portion of Springfield's population is performed by a very small number of people. Which means there are conversations in this show between four characters that are, in the recording booth, one person talking to themselves. There are episodes where a single performer voices most of the speaking roles in a scene, and the scene works, and you would never know. That is one of the great invisible achievements of the series, and it is entirely hidden by design. The performances are so distinct that the audience does not register them as coming from the same throat. Let's talk about the recordings themselves. The show records its cast together in a room, at a table, which was once standard practice in animation, and became unusual as the industry moved towards individual sessions. That choice produced a specific quality in the performances. The characters interrupt each other. They react. The timing has the texture of a real conversation rather than assembled lines. And it produced outtakes. There is a body of alternate takes, improvisations, and mistakes from those sessions, some of which have been released on home video and which constitute a hidden version of the show consisting entirely of things that did not make it. There are jokes in those outtakes that never aired. There are performances that were rejected. There are moments where the cast broke down laughing at a line that was cut for time. Let's talk about the deleted scenes. Animation is expensive, which means scenes are rarely animated and then cut. Usually cuts happen at script stage, before anybody draws anything. But it does happen. Episodes come in long, and material gets removed after animation, and a substantial amount of that material has been released on home video over the years. Watching those deleted scenes is a strange experience because they are fully finished. They look exactly like the show. They simply do not exist in the version anybody has seen. There are jokes in there that are genuinely excellent, removed for pace. There are entire subplots removed for length. There are alternate endings. And there are scenes that were cut for reasons other than time, which is where it gets interesting. There is material that was removed because it was too dark, too pointed, or too likely to cause a problem. That material exists. Some of it has been seen. Let's talk about the episodes that were changed after broadcast. This is a genuinely modern phenomenon, and it is worth understanding. Episodes of this show have been altered after their original airing, sometimes for legal reasons, sometimes because a joke referenced somebody whose public status subsequently changed dramatically, sometimes because a scene contained an image that later events made unbearable. There is at least one famous case in which a shot was removed from syndicated and streaming versions because of a real-world tragedy, and the original version is now difficult to see. There is at least one case of an entire episode being withdrawn from circulation because a guest performer's subsequent public disgrace made it untenable. And there are cases of small alterations, a line changed, a background element painted over, a location reference altered between the broadcast version and the syndicated version, which we touched on earlier when discussing where this town actually is, which means that the show as it currently exists on streaming platforms is not identical to the show that aired. There are differences. Some are documented, some are not. For a certain kind of viewer, tracking those changes is the most compelling Easter egg hunt of all, because it involves finding things that have been deliberately removed. There is also the matter of aspect ratio. For its first 20 seasons, the show was made for a squarer screen. When it was reformatted for widescreen streaming, the picture was cropped, and the crop removed material from the top and bottom of every frame. That means a substantial number of visual gags in classic episodes are invisible in the widescreen versions. Jokes drawn at the edges of the frame have been cut off. Sign text has been truncated. Characters standing at the boundaries have been removed. There was a significant public complaint about this, and eventually the option to view the original framing was restored on some platforms. But for a period, an entire generation was watching a version of this show with a portion of its background comedy physically removed from the image. That is a genuinely melancholy piece of media history. Artists spent years hiding jokes in the corners of the frame, and then the frame got smaller. Let's finish this section with my favorite category of buried thread, which is the unresolved emotional beat. There are moments in this show where something is established about a character that is genuinely serious, and it is never revisited. A character reveals a loss. A character admits to a fear. A character says something about their own life that reframes everything you thought you knew, and then the credits roll and the next episode begins and nobody mentions it again. Those moments accumulate. Watch enough of this show and you build up a shadow version of the town, composed entirely of things people said once and never repeated. The bartender's loneliness, the neighbor's grief, the teacher's disappointment, the police chief's awareness of his own failure, the billionaire's occasional glimpses of what he has become. None of those threads go anywhere. The format forbids it. Everybody has to be back in position by next week, which means Springfield is full of people carrying things they mentioned once in a moment of weakness and were never allowed to mention again. That is the deepest Easter egg in the entire series, and it is hidden in plain sight in almost every episode. You just have to be listening at the right moment, and then let it go, exactly the way they do. Let's move to the last section. We are deep into the night now, and there is a pile of things left over that do not fit neatly into any of the categories we have been through. So, let's just go through them, slowly, one at a time, the way you might empty a drawer. Let's start with the secret society. There is an ancient fraternal order operating in Springfield, and an episode reveals its existence, its rituals, its hierarchy, and its extraordinary influence over world events. The details of that organization are wonderfully specific. Members have numbers indicating rank. The father is assigned a number, and that number has become a fan touchstone. There is a hierarchy above him, consisting of people whose identities are, in most cases, exactly who you would expect. The society's anthem lists the things it secretly controls, and that list is one of the most quoted pieces of writing in the show. It includes institutions of genuine power and at least one thing that is delightfully trivial, and the joke lands because of the juxtaposition. There is also a running detail about the society's headquarters, which is hidden inside an ordinary building in the town, and which has appeared in the background of other episodes to those who are looking. Let's talk about the license plates. Vehicles in Springfield have license plates, and those plates carry jokes. Sometimes they are references. Sometimes they are the owner's initials. Sometimes they reveal something about the character that the dialogue does not. There is a running gag involving a particular plate design, and there are plates that identify visiting characters as being from elsewhere, which is a small piece of world building hidden in a rectangle of pixels. Let's talk about the mystery spot. There is an attraction on the outskirts of Springfield that appears in the background of a small number of episodes. It is a roadside tourist trap of a specific American type, the sort of place that claims gravity works differently inside. It appears, it is never explained. It is simply part of the town, sitting there on the road out of town, next to the gorge and the dam and the various other pieces of infrastructure the show has established over the years. Springfield's geography is famously incoherent, as we discussed when talking about the signs. But the individual pieces of it are surprisingly consistent. The gorge is always in the same relationship to the town. The dam exists. The nuclear plant sits where it sits. The mountains are where they are. The town does not add up, and yet every individual part of it is stable. Let's talk about the sundial. We mentioned it earlier. There is a sundial in the town square, and it became the center of the show's most famous mystery. But look at it in other episodes and you will notice that it is a permanent fixture, present in scenes filmed in that square long before and long after the mystery. That is a nice example of the show's background art creating an opportunity that the writers later used. The sundial was set dressing. Then somebody realized it was a place where a body could fall in an interesting way, which means Springfield's most famous piece of evidence exists because an artist needed to fill a town square in 1990. Let's talk about the couch in the museum. There is a running joke in which the family's living room, or elements of it, appear in context that suggests the show is aware of its own status as an artifact. There have been couch gags set in museums. There have been moments in which the characters encounter merchandise of themselves. The show has a complicated and long-running relationship with its own fame, and that relationship is expressed almost entirely in background details rather than dialogue. Let's talk about the hidden text on documents. Whenever a character in this show holds up a document, that document has been written fully, in detail, even though the camera will show it for a fraction of a second. There are wills, contracts, medical reports, school records, police files, and legal briefs in this show that contain complete, coherent, funny text. Somebody wrote every word of them. There is a famous instance involving a character's medical file, and the diagnoses listed on it constitute a joke considerably darker than anything in the dialogue of that episode. There is an instance involving a school report card that reveals more about a character's academic history than the show ever says out loud. There is an instance involving a legal document whose fine print, when read, reverses the meaning of the entire scene. Those are the purest freeze-frame gags in the series, and they were written on the assumption of an audience of nobody. Let's talk about the pauses. There is a specific comedic technique this show uses that is essentially invisible, and it is worth naming because once you notice it, you will hear it constantly. The show holds shots for slightly too long. A character will say something. The scene should cut. It does not. It holds for a beat, and then another beat, and the silence becomes the joke. That is a technique borrowed from a particular tradition of live-action comedy, and it is extremely difficult in animation because every frame of a held shot costs money and nothing is happening. Most cartoons cut constantly, because motion is what animation is for. This show learned to be still, and being still became one of its most powerful tools. The famous rake sequence is the extreme version of this, but it happens in small doses everywhere, in dozens of episodes, and it is one of the main reasons the show's comic rhythm feels different from every other animated program. Let's talk about the sound design. There are recurring sounds in this show that function as Easter eggs. There is a specific noise associated with a specific character's movement. There is a musical sting used for a particular kind of revelation. There is a sound used whenever a certain object appears. There is a running gag involving a piece of stock music that is used in exactly the wrong situations. And there is an entire vocabulary of vocalizations from the voice cast that are not words, that appear in scripts as instructions, and that the audience recognizes instantly. Let's talk about the animals in the background of the power plant. The facility where the father works has, over the years, been shown to contain wildlife. There are rats, there are, in some shots, creatures that are not clearly identifiable as any known species. There is a glow. None of this is ever addressed. It is set dressing in a workplace comedy. Let's talk about the school. Springfield Elementary is a building with a documented history within the show. Its condition has been established repeatedly. It has asbestos. It has structural problems. Its budget is catastrophic. And the background art supports this constantly. Ceiling tiles are missing. Lockers do not close. There is water damage. The school's trophy cabinet is a masterpiece of background comedy. Its contents indicate a school that has never won anything, and that has begun awarding itself trophies for participation, and then for attendance, and then for existing. The school's library has visible books with visible titles. The school's cafeteria has a menu, which we discussed. And the school staff room has a coffee machine that has become, across decades, one of the show's most reliably present objects. Let's talk about the church again, briefly, because there is one detail I did not mention. The interior of that church has a stained glass window, and the imagery in that window has been drawn with a surprising amount of care and changes between episodes. In some versions, the imagery is conventional. In others, it depicts scenes that are not conventional at all. Somebody has been quietly editing the theology of Springfield's church through its glazing for 30 years. Let's talk about the recurring guest characters who are versions of real people. The show has a tradition of celebrities appearing as themselves, and a separate tradition of characters who are unmistakable caricatures of real people without being named as them. That second category is where the interesting material is, legally and comedically. There are characters in this show who are transparently based on specific living individuals, given different names, and portrayed in ways that would be actionable if they were named. Fans have identified most of them. The show has never confirmed most of them. There is a character whose design, voice, and behavior point unmistakably at a specific media figure. There is a pointing at a specific musician. There is another pointing at a specific businessman. Each of those is an Easter egg with legal implications, hidden in a cartoon, in plain sight, for decades. Let's talk about the things in the fridge. There is a running detail in this show concerning the contents of the family's refrigerator, and it has been maintained with more consistency than most of the town's geography. The fridge contains beer. It contains leftovers of alarming vintage. It contains a small number of items that the mother has bought in an attempt to improve the family's diet and that nobody has touched. That last category is one of the quietest character jokes in the entire series. Somewhere on a shelf in that fridge, in the background of scenes across decades, there are vegetables slowly going bad, purchased in hope by a woman whose family will not eat them. Nobody has ever pointed at them. They are simply there, drawn, in shot, decaying. Let's talk about the shelves in the convenience store. The Quickie Mart's interior has been drawn thousands of times, and the products on those shelves are inventions. There is a full snack aisle of things that do not exist. There is a magazine rack with titles. That magazine rack is worth freezing on. The publications in it are jokes about the publishing industry, and several of them are extremely specific parodies of real titles that existed at the time and no longer do, which means the magazine rack in a fictional convenience store is now an accidental record of the periodical market of the 1990s. Let's talk about the bulletin boards. Springfield has bulletin boards. They appear in the school, the church, the community center, the supermarket, and the workplace. And they are always covered in notices. Those notices have text. Somebody wrote them. They advertise lost pets, offer services, announce meetings, and make appeals. There is a running joke, visible only to people who read background art, in which the same lost pet notice appears on multiple boards, across multiple episodes, and multiple years. Somewhere in that town, an animal has been missing since the 1990s, and its owner is still putting up posters. Nobody wrote that as a joke. It happened because an asset got reused. And it is now, in the accumulated text of the show, a small tragedy running quietly in the background of a comedy. Let's talk about the clocks. There is a rule in animation that most viewers never consciously register, and it concerns timepieces. Any clock visible on screen has to be drawn, and a drawn clock has to show a time, and somebody has to choose that time. In most productions, clocks are set to whatever is convenient and then quietly ignored. Continuity between shots is not maintained because nobody is watching the clock. In this show, sometimes somebody is watching the clock. There are scenes in which the time shown on a wall clock advances correctly across the length of a conversation. There are scenes in which it does not, and the discrepancy is the joke. There are scenes in which a clock shows a time that contradicts everything else in the episode, and it has been sitting there, wrong, for 30 years. The clock in the school classroom is a particularly good one to watch. It appears constantly, and its behavior across the run of the series is completely inconsistent, which is either a continuity failure or a very long-running joke about the subjective experience of being a child in a classroom. The same is true of calendars. Calendars appear on walls in Springfield, and calendars are dangerous because a calendar contains a month and a year. A show with a floating timeline in which nobody ages and the present is always the present cannot afford to have a legible year on a wall. So the show has been careful. Most calendars in Springfield are drawn without a visible year, or with the year obscured, or with a month that does not correspond to anything in particular. But not all of them. There are calendars in this show that carry legible dates, and those dates conflict violently with each other, and with the show's own statements about when things happened. Fans have collected them. There are documents online listing every visible date in the entire run of the series, and the list does not resolve into any coherent timeline. It cannot. The show has been running for 36 years, while its characters have been living the same 18 months on a loop. Let's talk about the newspapers again for a second, because they have the same problem. A newspaper prop carries a date. Every time a character in this show reads a paper, somebody has had to decide whether to put a date on it, and that decision has been made differently by different artists across different decades. There are newspapers in Springfield with legible dates. There are newspapers with dates that have been deliberately smudged. There are newspapers where the date box contains a joke instead of a date. That last solution is the elegant one, and it is the one the show landed on most often. If you cannot answer a question, make the space where the answer would go into something funny, which is, honestly, a decent description of how this entire program handles its own contradictions. Let's talk about the seasons. Springfield experiences weather, and the weather is impossible. There are episodes with heavy snow and episodes with brutal heat, and the gap between them is frequently a single week of broadcast. Christmas happens, Halloween happens, summer holidays happen, and they happen repeatedly, out of order, in a town where the children never advance a grade. The show has made jokes about this, most pointedly in episodes where a character notes that a great deal seems to have happened in a very short span of time. But the background art has to solve the problem every single time. Somebody has to decide whether there are leaves on the trees. Somebody has to decide whether the grass is green. Somebody has to decide what people are wearing. And they have been making those decisions, week after week, for a town where time does not move, for longer than most of the people making them have been working in the industry. Let's talk about the people who find all of this. There is an enormous, largely unpaid, largely anonymous body of work dedicated to documenting the hidden material in this show, and it deserves acknowledgement. There are wikis with entries for every character, every location, every product, every sign. There are databases of chalkboard gags, of couch gags, of guest appearances. There are frame-by-frame annotations of famously dense episodes. There are people who have watched every episode with a notebook, cataloging background art. There are people who have transcribed every legible document that appears on screen. There are forums where a single freeze frame can generate 1,000-post discussion about whether a particular sign is a reference to a particular film. That work is a genuine achievement of collective scholarship, conducted for free by people scattered across the world about a cartoon. And it exists because the show earned it. You do not get that kind of devotion by accident. You get it by putting things in the corners of the frame for 36 years, and by rewarding attention, and by respecting the audience's intelligence to a degree that most commercial entertainment considers reckless. The show made a bet in 1989. The bet was that if you fill your work with material that most people will not notice, the people who do notice will build something around you. They did. They built an entire scholarly apparatus around a cartoon about a man who works at a nuclear plant and does not know how to do his job. Let's talk finally about the thing that these Easter eggs actually are. An Easter egg is a form of communication. It is a message from the maker to a viewer, sent across time, in a channel that bypasses the story entirely. It says something quite specific. It says, "I was here. I made this. I was paying attention, and if you are paying attention too, then we know something together that nobody else in the room knows." That is an intimate thing to say to a stranger. It is a small conspiracy, and it is one of the few forms of contact possible between people who make things and the people who receive them. A show like this one is made by hundreds of people over decades, most of whom will never be recognized in public, whose contributions are absorbed into a corporate product with a single famous name attached. The Easter egg is the one place where an individual can put a fingerprint. So the town is covered in fingerprints. Every sign, every equation, every gravestone, every joke document, every reference to a film somebody loved when they were 19. Springfield is not a place. It is a very large number of people saying "I was here" in the only language available to them, on the assumption that somebody, some night, would slow down enough to read it. Somebody has. Tonight, let's talk about the people in the booth, because there is a whole layer of hidden material that exists only in sound. The core voice cast of this show is very small. A handful of performers have supplied the overwhelming majority of the town's speaking population for more than 3 decades. And in doing so, they have buried an enormous number of jokes that are invisible on the page and inaudible unless you know what you are listening for. Let's start with the most famous case, which concerns the father's voice. The character does not sound now the way he sounded at the beginning. In the earliest episodes, the voice is lower, slower, and considerably more sardonic. It is the voice of a tired man who resents his life. Over the first few seasons, it rose in pitch, gained energy, and became the strangled, expressive instrument we know. That shift was not planned. It emerged from the performer discovering what the character could do, and it happened gradually enough that nobody watching week to week noticed, which means there is an entire alternate version of that character sitting in the first 2 seasons, waiting for anybody who watches them back to back with a modern episode. The same is true of several others. The bartender's voice changed. The boss's voice changed. The neighbor's voice changed dramatically, becoming considerably more elaborate over time as the performer found new places to go. There are early episodes where a character sounds so different that a casual listener would assume it was a different actor. Now, let's talk about the doubling. The show's cast handle enormous numbers of roles each. One performer voices the boss, the assistant, the neighbor, the reverend, the principal, the police officer, the sea captain, the bartender's rival, and a substantial fraction of the town's professional class. Another voices the boy, the bully, the school troublemaker, the elderly neighbor, and a very large number of children. Another voices the mother and both of her sisters, which means that in scenes with all 3, one person is performing a conversation between 3 siblings with 3 distinct smoking habits. Another voices the tavern owner, the convenience store clerk, the physician, the school groundskeeper, the crime boss, and the comic book proprietor. That doubling produces genuinely startling moments. There are scenes in this show where a single performer voices every speaking part, and the scene contains an argument. And it produces hidden jokes. The writers know who voices whom, and they occasionally construct scenes specifically so that two characters played by the same person have to interact. Those scenes exist as private jokes for the cast and for the small portion of the audience that knows the casting. There is at least one famous instance in which a character voiced by one performer impersonates another character voiced by the same performer, which is a joke that only fully lands if you know. Let's talk about the improvisation. Because the cast records together, and because animation allows for later adjustment, there is more improvisation in this show than in most scripted television. A significant number of the show's most quoted lines were not in the script. They were things a performer said in the room that everybody laughed at, and which were kept. There are catchphrases in this show that were invented at the microphone. There are character quirks that emerged from a performer's choice and were then written into subsequent scripts. There are entire personalities that grew out of a single, improvised delivery. That is a very unusual way to build a fictional world. Large portions of Springfield's population exist in the form they do because somebody made a funny noise on a Tuesday and the room laughed. Let's talk about the guest performers who took it seriously. The show has hosted a very large number of guest voices, and there is a clear division between those who came in and read the lines and those who understood what the show was and committed entirely. The best guest performances in this series are frequently from people who had nothing to prove and could have phoned it in. There are dramatic actors who arrived and delivered performances of real weight. There are musicians who agreed to be mocked. There are figures of enormous public seriousness who came in and behaved absurdly for 20 minutes. And there is a smaller and more interesting category of guest, which is the person who appeared as themselves and used the appearance to say something they could not say elsewhere. There are episodes in which a public figure used a cartoon to address their own reputation. There are episodes in which somebody played a version of themselves that was considerably more honest than their public image. That is a strange gift for a comedy to offer. Come and be a cartoon, and while you are here, tell the truth. Let's talk about the singing. A substantial number of the cast can sing, and the show has exploited this heavily. There are performers on this show with genuine musical training whose characters have had entire numbers built around them. And there is a specific hidden pleasure in the fact that the singing voices are the real voices. The characters sing in character. Nobody is dubbed, which means that when a character performs a difficult vocal line, an actual person did that. In a booth, in a cartoon voice. Let's talk about the recordings that were never used. Every episode generates far more recorded material than airs. Alternate readings, improvisations that did not fit, lines cut in the edit. Some of that material has been released, much of it has not. There is a vault somewhere containing decades of audio from a small group of people doing hundreds of voices, and the overwhelming majority of it has never been heard by anybody outside the production. That is a genuine hidden archive. It is the largest unreleased body of comedy in the medium, and it exists on tape and hard drives in a building somewhere. Let's talk about the deaths. The show has, inevitably, lost people. Cast members have died. Writers have died. Musicians who performed on the score have died. And when that happens, the show responds, usually quietly. There have been dedications. There have been episodes retired from rotation. There have been characters retired because nobody else could do the voice, and nobody wanted to try. There have been moments where a character continues to appear, performed by somebody else, and the difference is audible to anybody who knew the original. That is the strangest form of hidden material in the entire series, because it is not a joke. It is a change in the sound of a fictional town caused by an actual death, and it is audible to anybody paying attention, and it is never explained on screen. There are voices in Springfield that belong to people who are no longer alive, still playing, every week, in reruns, on screens all over the world. Let's talk about the accents. The show's approach to accent and dialect has been, across 36 years, both extraordinarily skilled and periodically controversial, and both of those things are worth acknowledging. On the skilled side, this show contains some of the most precise regional American voice work in the medium. There are characters whose accents locate them to specific regions with real accuracy. There are characters whose speech patterns encode their class background, their education, and their generation. On the controversial side, the show has made choices about certain characters that were widely accepted at the time and have been extensively debated since, And it has responded to that debate in various ways over the years, including changes to casting practice. That is a live conversation rather than a settled one, and it is part of the show's history in the same way that everything else we have discussed is. Let's talk about the sound of the town. Beyond the voices, there is an entire hidden layer of audio design in this show, and it is remarkably consistent. The power plant has a sound. It hums. That hum has been present in every scene set in that building for decades, and it is subtly wrong in a way that suggests something is not correctly contained. The tavern has a sound. There is a specific ambience, a low murmur of a bar with too few customers. The school has a sound. There are distant children, distant bells, distant announcements. Those ambiences were designed once and have been maintained, which means that if you closed your eyes during an episode, you could identify the location from the background noise alone. That is set dressing you cannot see, produced by people whose names appear in credits that nobody reads, and it is one of the reasons Springfield feels like a real place rather than a series of drawings. Let's finish this section with something small. There is a laugh in this show. Several characters have distinctive laughs, and one in particular has become a piece of universal vocabulary. It is 2 syllables. It is entirely mocking. It is delivered by a school bully with a home life that the show has quietly established as genuinely difficult. That laugh is used, in real life, by people all over the world, constantly, usually by people who have never seen an episode. It came from a booth. Somebody made that noise once into a microphone, and it escaped the show entirely and became a sound that human beings make at each other. I think that is a good place to leave the voices. They made noises in a room, and the noises got out, and now they are everywhere. There is one more layer, and it is the strangest of all. At some point in the 1990s, this show became aware of itself. I do not mean that in a mystical sense. I mean that the writers began to build jokes on the assumption that the audience knew the show's own production history, its critical reputation, its commercial situation, and its internal politics. And they began hiding material in the show about the show. Once you start looking for that layer, it is everywhere. Let's start with the cartoon within the cartoon. The violent cat and mouse program that the children watch is, on its surface, a joke about the excesses of classic animation. But over the years, it became something else. It became the show's mechanism for talking about itself. There is an episode in which that fictional cartoon, long-running and creatively exhausted, introduces a new character to boost ratings. The new character is designed by committee. He is focus grouped. He is given an edgy attitude and a marketable catchphrase. He is voiced by a performer who does not want to be there. And he is a disaster. He is hated instantly. He kills the very thing he was designed to save. That episode aired while The Simpsons was itself in the middle of an ongoing conversation about whether it had peaked. It is a story about a beloved long-running cartoon adding a character to stay relevant, made by a beloved long-running cartoon, and its writers knew exactly what they were doing. The name of that character has since become industry shorthand. When any long-running show adds a desperate new element, people use his name. That is a piece of vocabulary invented by a cartoon to describe a phenomenon that the cartoon was simultaneously experiencing. That fictional cartoon has served this purpose repeatedly. Its creator's biography is a satire of animation history. Its production practices are a satire of the industry. Its merchandising is a satire of merchandising. There is an episode in which the fictional cartoon's own studio is examined, and the conditions inside it are grim in a way that the audience is invited to find funny and is also, in the industry, entirely accurate. Let's talk about the flash forwards. The show cannot allow its characters to age. That is the deal. But it has repeatedly imagined what would happen if they did. There is an episode set in the future in which the daughter is grown and about to be married. It is one of the most acclaimed things the show has ever made, and it is remarkable because of how seriously it takes the question of who these people would become. There have been many others since, and they contradict each other constantly, because each one is a fresh imagining rather than a canonical future. And those futures are packed with Easter eggs. Each one has to design a version of the town decades ahead, which means the background artists get to invent future Springfield, future signage, future technology, future versions of the businesses we know. Some of the predictions in those episodes have aged remarkably well. Some have aged terribly. All of them are visible in the background for a few seconds each. There is a running detail across those future episodes concerning what happens to specific minor characters, and the show has been surprisingly consistent about some of them, which suggests somebody is keeping notes. Let's talk about the milestone episodes. Every time the show reaches a significant episode number, it does something. Some milestones got clip shows, some got documentary parodies, some got episodes that directly address the show's own age and status, some got nothing at all, which was itself a statement. Those milestone episodes are dense with self-reference. They contain callbacks, cameos from characters not seen in decades, and jokes about the show's own reputation that would be unthinkable in any other commercial property. There is an episode in which the show mocks its own perceived decline in quality, using its own characters, with the full support of the network airing it. There are very few television programs that have been permitted to insult themselves that thoroughly on air. Let's talk about the guest appearances by the show's own creators. Members of the production have appeared in the show as themselves or as characters. Writers have voiced roles, the creator has appeared, producers have been caricatured. There are episodes in which the show's own writing process is depicted, and the depiction is unflattering in ways that suggest genuine catharsis. Let's talk about the fourth wall. This show breaks the fourth wall rarely, which is why it lands hard when it does. There are moments in which a character looks at the camera. There are moments in which a character acknowledges being animated. There are moments in which the show acknowledges its own runtime, its own advertisements, its own network. And there is a specific and rather beautiful category of moment in which the show acknowledges its audience directly, not as consumers but as people who have been watching for a very long time. Those moments are rare. They are usually quiet. They tend to arrive at the end of an episode, in a final beat, delivered without a joke attached. If you have watched this show since childhood, you know the ones I mean. There is a particular feeling they produce which is difficult to describe and which is essentially the feeling of being noticed by something you did not expect to notice you. Let's talk about the endings that were written and never used. The show has, at various points across its history, prepared for the possibility of ending. There are reports of a final scene having been written long ago, held in reserve, to be used whenever the series concluded. The details of it have been discussed by the show's producers in interviews over the years, and the general shape of it involves a return to a beginning. Whether that ending still exists in any form, whether it has been revised, whether it will ever be used, is unknown. But the fact of it is one of the great hidden objects in the show's history. Somewhere, in a drawer or a file, there is a final scene for The Simpsons that has been waiting for decades. That is an Easter egg you cannot find, because it is not in the show. It is in the world outside it, waiting. Let's talk about the last frame. Every episode of this show ends the same way. The credits roll over a specific piece of music, and a logo appears, and there is a sound. That production logo and the sound attached to it has terrified more children than most horror films. There is a genuine, well-documented phenomenon of people who grew up with this show having a specific fear response to that logo, because it arrived at the end of something they loved and signaled that it was over. The logo has changed over the years, and each version has its own associations for the generation that grew up with it. And there is a small tradition in certain episodes of the show playing with that logo, altering it, interrupting it, having a character interact with it. Those are the last Easter eggs of any episode, hidden after the point where most people have stopped watching. Let's talk about what happens now. The show is still running. It has been renewed repeatedly. It shows no particular sign of stopping, and the economics of it make stopping unlikely in the near future, which means the Easter eggs are still being made. Somewhere, right now, an artist is drawing a shop sign for a background that will appear on screen for a second and a half in an episode that will air months from now. They are choosing what that sign says. Nobody has told them what to write. They are probably going to hide something in it. And somebody some night in the future is going to pause on it and read it and laugh and never know who wrote it. That transaction has happened millions of times. It will keep happening for as long as this thing runs, and probably for a long time afterwards, because the episodes will remain and the pausing will continue. Let's spend the last few minutes on the one Easter egg that took 36 years to hatch. When this show began, it was a small, scruffy, faintly disreputable program on a network that barely existed. It was made cheaply. It was criticized in newspapers. There were school districts that banned its merchandise. There were politicians who used it as an example of cultural decline. Nobody in Vucular expected it to last. The scripts from that period were written by people who assumed they had 2 or 3 years. And because they assumed that, they filled the show with things that would only matter if it lasted. They built a town with more residents than the story needed. They gave background characters names. They established relationships between people who would never share a scene. They put jokes in the corners of frames on the assumption that nobody would see them. And they kept doing it after it became clear that this thing was not going to end. The result is a work whose density increases the longer you look at it, made by people who had no reason to believe anybody would ever look that hard. Which brings us to the last hidden thing. Somewhere in the first season of this show, in the background of a scene that is about something else, there is a detail that nobody noticed in 1990 and that has since become significant. A building that would later matter. A character who would later have a name. A sign that would later become a running joke. The people who drew that frame had no idea. They were filling space on a deadline for a program they assumed would be canceled. And now it is 36 years later, and that frame has been paused by more people than have read most novels, and the detail in the corner has an entry in an encyclopedia written by volunteers. That is what happens when a thing lasts. The accidents become architecture, the filler becomes canon. The jokes drawn at 4 in the morning by exhausted artists become the objects of scholarly attention. Nobody planned it. There was no plan available. You cannot plan a 36-year cultural artifact. You can only make 1 week at a time, carefully, with more care than the week deserves, and then find out later what you built. We have been in Springfield for a long time tonight. We have read the chalkboard. We have looked at the couch and the 700 ways the family has failed to sit on it. We have gone through the shop signs and the church notices and the cinema marquee. We have looked at the 2 men who have been sitting silently in the same bar since 1989. We have found real mathematics floating in a Halloween cartoon. We have found a teapot that belongs to computer graphics history, drifting through a void. We have found the initials of a man hidden in the ear of the most famous cartoon face in the world. We have walked through a house that cannot exist and that you could nonetheless navigate blindfolded. We have visited the one real version of that house, built in Nevada, given away to somebody who did not want it, and painted over. We have followed the town out into the world, into video games and theme parks and dictionaries and baseball. And underneath all of it, the same thing kept appearing. Somebody cared about a detail that nobody was going to see. That is the whole story. That is what an Easter egg is. It is care applied to a place where care is not required, by a person who will not be thanked, for an audience that may not exist. The show is 36 years old. It has outlived the technology it was made for, the network landscape it was made in, and a substantial number of the people who made it. It has been declared finished 100 times, and it is still going. And the reason it is still going, I think, has less to do with the plots and the catchphrases than with this hidden layer. Because a show you can only watch once is entertainment. A show you can excavate is something else. It becomes a place. And places do not get switched off. You can go back to Springfield tonight and find something you have never seen. In an episode you have seen 40 times, drawn by somebody whose name is not in the credits, in the corner of a frame that was on screen for less time than it took you to blink. That is a very good reason to keep a town around. And here is the last thought I want to leave you with, as the room goes quiet. You have almost certainly walked past something today that was made with more care than it needed. A tile laid slightly better than required. A corner of a building finished properly where nobody would look. A small decorative flourish on a piece of ironwork on a street you were hurrying down. Somebody put that there. They were not paid extra for it. Nobody asked. They did it because they were making something and they wanted it to be good in the places that did not show. The world is full of that. It is genuinely everywhere, and most of it goes unnoticed for entire lifetimes. The reason this cartoon has such a hold on people, I think, is that it made that impulse visible. It took the instinct to put care where care is not required, and it turned it into a 36-year practice conducted by hundreds of people in full view of an audience of millions. And then it waited. That is a hopeful thing to hold on to, in the small hours, with the lights off. Somewhere, right now, somebody is doing careful work on a part of something that nobody is going to inspect. They are not doing it for recognition. Recognition is not available. They are doing it because it is the right way to make a thing. So sleep well. The couch will be there tomorrow. The chalkboard will have something new on it. Somebody will have hidden something in the background of a shot about something else entirely, and it will wait, patiently, in the corner of the frame, for as long as it takes. That is what they do. They wait to be found. Good night,